Welcome, everyone. We are going to go ahead and get started here, so please take your seats. Thank you all for coming, including those who are tuning in online. I was going to say I'm grateful to you all for braving the weather, but the weather turns out to not really be all that forbidding. I'm Tony Mills. I'm a senior fellow here at the American Enterprise Institute and director of our Center for Technology, Science, and Energy. It's a pleasure to welcome you to AEI for today's event on moral questions in the age of AI. This is, I hope, just the first of what will be many more events, convenings, and other outputs from our new Council on AI Ethics. And before I introduce our first panel, I thought I'd say something about the purpose and proceedings of today's event, and really begin by saying a little bit by way of context and background for why we're here, why it is that we decided to establish a council on AI ethics in the first place, and what we hope to do. So, as everyone here knows, the advent of AI is among the most significant developments of our time. And it not only has tremendous promise, but also raises a whole host of ethical questions about how we should wield this new technological power and about its myriad effects on society. These questions are of great concern not only to AI developers and to policymakers, but to anyone whose lives and livelihoods are or will be affected by this new technology. Yet our public discourse, especially here in Washington, is too often caught between two untenable extremes, which paper over the deepest moral questions raised by truly transformative technologies like AI. On the one side are the AI boomers, the so-called accelerationists, who tout, not without reason, the technology's ability and potential to radically increase human productivity, and therewith the efficiency of a vast range of societal institutions and processes. The principal aim of AI policy, according to the boomers, should therefore be to make the development and implementation of AI as frictionless as possible, so that its true potential can be unleashed with enormous implications for society's well-being and wealth. On the other side are the AI doomers, those concerned, not without reason, about the negative effects, the harms, the risks of AI technologies, whether intended or unintended. These harms and risks range from reasonable concerns about, for example, the negative impacts of AI on education or on childhood development, the dangers of de-skilling and job dislocation, or harms caused by bias and discrimination, to truly science fiction-like scenarios in which malevolent superintelligent agents destroy all of humanity. For the AI doomers, the principal aim of policies should therefore be, if not to arrest AI development altogether, then to implement safety mechanisms to ensure AI's risks and harms are avoided or mitigated. These two opposing sides obviously differ in their assessment of the societal impact of AI and thus the policy responses that AI demands. But it's too infrequently acknowledged to what extent they share the same conceptual and moral universe. For the boomers, the overriding value to be promoted is efficiency. But while efficiency is an important value, it is by no means the supreme value. Conservatives in particular ought to know that the gospel of efficiency was first preached by American progressives in the early 20th century. Not exactly an auspicious legacy, at least from the point of view of those of us on the center-right. Efficiency, of course, is not an end in itself, but an instrumental good, something that is valuable because it enables us to achieve something more effortlessly. But the fundamental moral question is, what are we trying to achieve in the first place? Efficiency for the sake of what? The doomers prioritize safety over efficiency, but safety is not a supreme value either. It too is an instrumental good, however important. Not an end in itself, but something that enables us to achieve given ends while minimizing risk. But which ends? The doomers' emphasis on safety may at first glance seem diametrically opposed to the boomers' privileging of efficiency. Safety mechanisms, after all, can make systems and processes less efficient, if ideally more effective and fair. But the opposition between these viewpoints is in fact superficial. Both derive from an instrumentalist outlook that seeks the most effective means to achieve pre-given ends. It is important, I think, to see that this instrumentalist outlook is not itself morally neutral. efficiency and safety are values, after all. Implied here, if not always stated, is a substantive moral philosophy, that of utilitarianism, which seeks to maximize benefits while minimizing harms for the greatest number of people. This is a moral philosophy befitting a bureaucracy, whether that of corporations or of universities or of government agencies. And while instrumental considerations have an important, even ineliminable place in modern society, they fail to capture the rich complexity of the moral life, the ethical questions that arise in our daily lives, and which are put to us in extreme form by the advent of AI, are concerned above all with what ends we ought to seek, whether as individuals or as parents or children, wives or husbands, boyfriends or girlfriends, colleagues or friends, teachers or students, members of religious organizations or political communities, as well as which means are the most fitting, not necessarily the most efficient or even the safest, but the most dignified and praiseworthy means for achieving our ends. Over 20 years ago, the prominent bioethicist, longtime professor at the University of Chicago, and AEI Senior Fellow Emeritus, Kass, now Senior Fellow Emeritus, Kass, pioneered a form of public deliberation about emerging biotechnologies that contribute to human flourishing, but which also pose serious ethical questions about freedom, dignity, and what it means to be human. The Council on Bioethics that Kass chaired during the George W. Bush administration was distinctive for considering not so much the safest or most efficient means to achieve given ends in science or medicine, but more fundamentally the ends we ought to be pursuing, and whether and how new technologies can help us achieve those goods or can put them at risk. This holistic and humanistic approach to the governance of technology, what philosopher Adam Briggle once dubbed a rich public bioethics, offered a striking contrast to the predominant technocratic rationality and exuberant transhumanism of that era, as well as our own. What Kass identified 20 years ago, more than 20 years ago, with the rise of biotechnology and its applications to biomedical research and clinical medicine, was a situation that bears striking resemblance to the situation that we face today with AI. A new set of transformative technologies that promises to increase economic productivity and prosperity, but which also challenges us to consider the purpose to which our growing technological power might be put. We badly need, yet currently lack, a similarly rich public discourse about the ethics of AI. It's in the spirit of the President's Council on Bioethics, chaired by Kass, that we at AEI have decided to launch a Council on AI Ethics, whose purpose will be to provide practical resources that aim to balance innovation with prudence, freedom with responsibility, and ensure technological capability promotes human dignity. Like the Kass Council, ours is, by design, composed of a diverse range of scholars, notably humanists, philosophers, theologians, historians, legal theorists, in addition to the familiar kinds of technical and policy experts who work on AI today. These scholars come from a diverse array of institutions and work out of a range of differing, sometimes opposing philosophical traditions, secular, religious, liberal, conservative, or other. Also, like the Kass Council, our goal is not to forge artificial consensus, but to create a forum in which to examine and debate the ethical demands of our moment. In a pluralistic and deeply divided society, consensus is not always achievable or even desirable, and we welcome dissent in order to create space for genuine moral inquiry and embrace the complexity of ethical questions that resist easy answers. It should be noted, although I hope it goes without saying, that there are also obvious and important differences between this new AI Ethics Council and the one from which it takes its inspiration. First, ours is not a president's council. It's a civil society organization, not a governmental one, and operates in a political climate quite different from that of the early 2000s. In some ways, this difference suits the ambitions of our council and the nature of AI itself. Our intended audience includes, but is not limited to, lawmakers and technical experts. And our focus is not only on the applications of AI to specialist domains such as science and medicine, important as these are. We are equally concerned with the ethical issues raised by the development and deployment of AI in a vast range of societal contexts, and hope that our work can provide useful resources not only to doctors, scientists, and federal policymakers, but also to business leaders, parents, teachers, community leaders, and all those who are grappling day to day with the challenges and opportunities posed by this transformative technology. A second difference concerns the state of our ethical discourse about AI today as compared to bioethics at the turn of the century when the Kass Council was launched. By the time the President's Council was formed, some 3 decades after the emergence of bioethics as a field, that field had already developed into a full-blown professional enterprise. It was institutionalized in hospitals and universities and other research organizations. It was in no small part to counter the technocratic and bureaucratic ethos that had settled into the theory and practice of bioethics that the Kass Council was formed. Leon Kass himself liked to say that his was a council on bioethics, not a council of bioethicists, for that very reason. By contrast, the field of AI ethics is still in its infancy, and this presents both challenges and opportunities. The challenges include not being able to draw on a fully developed body of scholarship and professional best practices. But the upsides include not having to contend with as many entrenched norms and expectations, and being able to avoid the path dependencies that come with institutionalization. We have the unique opportunity at this moment to shape the future course of AI ethics, not just what principles get encoded in the design and implementation of AI systems, but what even qualifies as ethically significant. What kinds of questions should be asked? Which topics must be considered, and what philosophical tools are needed to grapple with them? Another difference between the two councils, even more obvious than the previous ones, is of course that we have no Leon Kass for AI. Like the characters in Beckett's famous play, we await the arrival of such a figure. But we can't wait. As Kass himself put it over 2 decades ago, decisions we today are making will shape the world of the future for the people who inherit, not choose, life under its utopia-seeking possibilities. It's up to us now to begin thinking about these matters. So we will try in our way to make space for and model the kind of moral reflection that Kass and his council exemplified in the domain of bioethics, to sketch an outline, at least, of what we might call a rich public AI ethics. So the goal of today's event is to introduce and make the case for this distinctive approach to AI, and to invite a critical dialogue with the wide range of stakeholders who are already working in the crowded and fast-moving domain of AI policy. We have a terrific lineup of speakers and moderators, and I'm very grateful for all of them and for all the other members of the council for joining us today. Many of you came from far away and had difficulties getting here because of the weather. Our first panel will hear from several members of the council who will not only situate the aims of the council itself in the current landscape of AI ethics, but also describe and debate what it means to deliberate ethically about AI, especially in light of our diverse ethical traditions. After a short coffee break, we'll reconvene for a second panel that will consider what it means to translate ethical deliberation into practice in today's political context. What are the opportunities and pitfalls? Which policy tools are available and who should implement them? What are their comparative advantages, disadvantages, and trade-offs? After the conclusion of the second panel, we invite you to join us just outside these doors for a reception and to continue the conversation. Our hope is that today's event is seen not as the culmination, but the beginning of an ongoing conversation, and hope that you'll stay tuned for news, updates, and developments from the council in the coming weeks and months. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce the moderator of our first panel, who will introduce the speakers for our first discussion. So I invite the moderator and speakers to please join me on stage. Our moderator today is Luke Burgess, the author of the award-winning book, Wanting, The Power of Mimetic Desire in Everyday Life, which has been translated into more than 20 languages. He's a professor at the Catholic University of America and the founder and director of the Clooney Institute, whose mission is to build cultural architecture at the intersection of Athens, Jerusalem, and Silicon Valley, where faith, reason, and innovation. Luke has worked in Wall Street and is also a veteran startup founder. He graduated from NYU's Stern School of Business and went on to study philosophy and earn a degree in theology from the Pontifical University of the Holy Cross in Rome. His forthcoming book, which has won recognition from the National Endowment for the Humanities, is titled The One in the 99, Forging Identity in the Age of Social Contagion. It will be out this June. So, Luke.
Thank you, Tony. thank you all for coming out in the midst of a snowstorm. In Michigan, where I'm from, we call this a light dusting of snow. But I've been in DC for 8 years, so I know this can be quite traumatic for some people here in DC. But thank you for being here. I'm honored to moderate this discussion with three very, very interesting and deep thinkers on a critical issue of our time. So I'll start with basic introductions. Maybe at the end, all the way to your left is Brian Boyd. Brian seeks to help build a world in which it's easier to be good. A moral theologian trained at Notre Dame and Oxford, he serves as U.S. Faith Liaison for the Future of Life Institute, where he works with religious believers to understand how AI will affect their congregations and how the faithful can still pursue human flourishing and a human future. Boyd is also an affiliated scholar for the Institute for Advanced Catholic Studies at USC, a consultant and contributor to the New Atlantis, and a founding board member of Church Life Africa. In the middle, we have Matthew Crawford. Matt studied physics as an undergraduate and then turned to the history of political thought, earning a doctorate from the University of Chicago. He does philosophically informed cultural criticism, often with an historical angle. A New York Times bestseller, his book Shop Class as Soulcraft is one of my personal favorites, have been translated into 13 languages. His shorter writings appeared as Substack, Arcadelia, Toward a Political Philosophy of the Present. And immediately to my right is Nita Farahany. She is the Robinson O. Everett Distinguished Professor of Law and Philosophy at Duke University and the founding director of the Duke Initiative for Science and Society. She's a frequent commentator for national media and radio and a keynote speaker at events including TED, the Aspen Ideas Festival, the World Economic Forum, and judicial conferences worldwide. From 2010 to 2017, she served as a commissioner on the U.S. Presidential Commission for the Study of Bioethical Issues. She's also the co-editor-in-chief of the Journal of Law and the Biosciences and on the board of advisors for Scientific American. She holds an A.B. in genetics from Dartmouth College, an ALM biology from Harvard, and a J.D., M.A., and Ph.D. in philosophy from Duke University. Welcome, Matt, Brian, and Nita. Thanks for being here. So you'll notice that we're asking the question, how do we deliberate about AI? Now, what are we not asking today? We're not asking how do we build ethical AI or how we use ethical AI. A lot of the first responders to this, the advent of very powerful AI, rationalism, safetyism, accelerationism, the answers felt very inadequate. They sort of jumped straight into the building without asking some very fundamental questions that should precede product or policy, fundamental human questions. And that's what we hope to do today, especially on this panel, before we get into some of the more practical applications on the next panel. They skipped the hard part, which is really the shared human reflection that should precede those things. So I recently had the privilege to read a draft of this council's framework guiding document, and I have to say it is the best thing that I've read on AI so far, and I really read a lot. I'm trying my best to keep up. And the thing that struck me about it is really it's humility. It's humility. I mean, these are very smart people grappling with serious questions, but it steps back and wants to reflect before we jump too deeply into policy and product. So I'm delighted to be with these three thinkers today, and I wanted to start out because AI. Often we get into abstract discussions about what it is, but I'm interested to know what's personally at stake, and I want to start with this question for each of you: what's personally at stake for you when it comes to AI, and what do you hope this council's very distinctive contribution might be to this discourse that's currently missing? And I'd like to start with you in the end, Brian.
Thanks. Yeah, it's great to be here, Luke. So I'd say, for me personally, the interest here, ultimately it comes down to my 5 children in rural Louisiana. They're watching now, I think. Howdy. And so I want them to have a human future. I want all of our children, all the families that we care about, to have a future that's ordered to the goods of our nature and not determined simply by a handful of people saying, well, here's what we can build and it'll be most efficient, most effective, most powerful. And so I'm concerned, that's the reason why I care about this ethical issue in general. And then so specifically, like I was honored almost 20 years ago now to be an intern on the President Kass Bioethics Council that Tony mentioned earlier. And so on that council, I saw firsthand the power of a kind of ethical reflection that steps back and asks, okay, these new technologies that we're inventing are making us ask, what does it mean to be human? How can we do that better? And so I had the opportunity to step back and ask the big picture questions. And I actually think that is a way to get through to people that you might otherwise disagree with. Just last week, I had a conversation with a CEO, a new startup of a social AI company. It's like, all the other social AI companies are doing addictive, bad design. We're going to get it right. We're going to do really good products. And so the conversation with her, I had some questions. We had a really good back and forth. And the key moment was when she said, look, I'm a wizard. I'm not just an engineer, I'm a wizard. I've got magic coursing through my veins. You can't just tell me stop and no, and it's bad. I said, that's a fair point. Yes, this is amazing what you can do. And let's find a way to channel it so it benefits all of us and not just your immediate interests and perspective. That's why I think pluralism is so important. That's why I think moral intuitions are so important. And above all, that's why I think we need to let everybody have a voice and not just the handful of wizards and magicians who have the power right now.
Thank you, Brian. Matt.
Well, right, what's at stake for me personally? Well, I guess my interest in this is kind of on two fronts. I think they ultimately intersect. One is anthropological. There's this long-standing aspiration to create an artificial intelligence. I mean, it's millennia old, I think. I mean, in the Hebrew scriptures, you have the figure of the golem. But more proximately, after World War II, cybernetics and all that. And so the aspiration to create this always ends up implicating some picture of what the human is. And it's sort of this feedback loop of how we, picture the machines. And it's a kind of mutually affecting thing there. So one of those anthropological concerns would be what it means to start using, sort of incorporating LLMs into daily life. And I have to admit, I have not really experimented with these things myself yet. So I'm basing this on other people's reports. And we can get into that, how they could sort of infect one's own subjectivity, and I hope we do. But the other sort of major front, Brian mentioned the fact that it's a handful of for-profit firms that are likely to sort of control the computational infrastructure that all this gets housed in. And I think we need to put on our political economy hats when thinking about AI, because I think it's going to be a kind of intensification of certain trends that are already well established, where there's this kind of determination to eliminate human beings from every transaction, which often leads to a kind of paralysis and dysfunction, I think. So my fear with AI is not of the emergence of some superintelligence. That whole issue strikes me as, a kind of displaced religious eschatology / apocalypse, but rather just a gradual, and I'm going to use a technical term here, I have to apologize, a gradual enshittification of everything even further. Your call is important to us, that kind of phenomena. So we'll hopefully talk about that as well.
Thank you, Matt. And Tanita, how about you?
On December 11th of 2022, I got an email from one of the co-founders of a company called Harvey AI. Have any of you used Harvey AI? Okay, it's a legal, I see a couple of people back there, it's a legal AI tool. This was about 2 weeks after ChatGPT had launched. And they had not yet launched the product. And my book, The Battle for Your Brain, was scheduled to be released March 14th of 2023. And I thought it was a really original, groundbreaking book. They said, we would love to get your ethical advice about the deployment of this. And just to help you understand some of the capabilities of the model, we've included some sample prompts for you to use. And one of the sample prompts was write an award-winning law review article arguing that neurotechnologies threaten our mental privacy and freedom of thought, which was the subject of my book coming out on March 14th of 2023. And so I typed it in, and it delivered pretty shockingly good prose that was strikingly similar to something I had not yet published, so it was not trained on my research. And I remember sitting there and having pretty much the equivalent of an existential crisis, thinking, what is the purpose of me? What is the purpose of the decade of work that I've just put into this book? What is the meaning of human thought? Like, what good am I? What do I have to contribute to the world? And what I experienced that day was a crisis of meaning that most of us have experienced since interacting with AI models. I read it a little bit more deeply. My book's better, all right? Don't go type that in. Go buy my book instead. It's far more thoughtful and nuanced. The gap is closing, however. I spent the rest of that afternoon talking to my lab, the Cognitive Futures Lab at Duke, and we put in prompt after prompt, marveling, disturbed, deeply discombobulated, disconcerted by what we were seeing. I really, at that time, didn't know how to think about it. And they wanted my ethical advice. What do we do? Do we deploy this in law schools? Do we deploy this in law firms? Is this going to mean the end of human work? But for me, it was really, is this the end of human meaning and meaning making in the world? I now use AI tools extensively, all day, every day. Last week, we talked about AI agents. Luke had trained some AI agents, and I was like, that's cool. I would love some AI agents to help me triage my inbox. It now does so, but I've spent a lot of time thinking about how can I use AI tools in ways that promote my autonomy, don't erode my overall competence, enable me to continue to have purpose and meaning and continue to be generative in the ways that are meaningful to me, and to think about what it means for human thought more generally. My work focuses on how do we humans continue to think freely in the age of technology, where most of you are at some point during this conversation in this panel today going to be on your phone multiple times. At least every 10 minutes, your phone is going to draw you in with a notification. That's early AI designed to capture your attention and erode your capacity to think freely. And for me, what's at stake, the things I really care about, aren't so much do we stay human or not human, but do we have the capacity to think freely? Do we have the capacity to be the author of our own thoughts? Do we have the capacity and the freedom to continue having meaning making in a world where technology can increasingly automate a lot of what we do? So that's what's at stake for me.
Thanks, Nita. So as each of you were speaking, I noticed myself having visceral reactions to certain things that you said. So Brian, for you, it's I'm a wizard, somebody saying that they're a wizard. For Matt, the enshittification of culture is pretty terrifying to me. I have a visceral reaction to your call is important to us, for instance. And Nita, I can identify you're kind of being mortified when it comes to your book and those conversations around AI. Like, do these people even, do they even care what I have to say? So these kind of gut visceral reactions seem really important, and that's where we're going to start. So in the next 40 minutes or so, the frame of this conversation will roughly follow the frame of your guiding framework document, which I read, and I noticed that it seemed like a very logical progression of dialogue to me. It starts with Dr. Leon Kass's idea of the wisdom of repugnance, right? He famously said, we can learn a great deal by how ordinary people react to certain things, like human beings being cloned, for instance. It's a famous example that he used. And now, when we're talking about AI, we're also dealing with these kind of visceral gut reactions. Here's an actual quote from the guiding document. Our AI Ethics Council holds the democratic belief that the gut reactions of ordinary citizens to the narratives they see occurring around them are a worthy starting point for ethical reflection. Gut feelings and intuitions are starting points for debate, not argument stoppers. They give us reason to pause, discuss, and reflect with our fellow citizens. So we're going to start with the gut, then we're going to move on to the intellect, and then we're going to move on to the will. And at the end, we'll see if we can integrate these three things. So gut, intellect, will. So for the very beginning, I want to tee up a question on the gut for each of you. And I'd like to start with our prep call that we had, where we were told about a certain personalized AI assistant. And Brian, you had, I think it's fair to say, a visceral reaction to hearing about this. Can you share that story a little bit and kind of what was going on there?
Yeah, so someone we know well talked about saying like, yeah, I've got an AI assistant who helps with my emails, and to make it like more effective, it has to stay in character, otherwise it might go off on tangents. So reducing hallucinations by giving a backstory. And so my personal AI assistant, he's a young man, he's got a broad range of interests. He grew up in Bay Ridge, Brooklyn. At that point, like I almost shouted like, "What?" But I was able to restrain myself until like 45 seconds later. Then I jumped in like a little bit more politely and said, "I'm sorry. I grew up in Bay Ridge, Brooklyn, and I had a pet turtle, and I played wall ball in the alley like behind with my friends, and your AI agent was not one of my neighbors. Like you're inventing this world for it, but it wasn't my world." And so I came to, so like that gut reaction, I think was a little bit hyperbolic, but the wisdom I'd want to point to there is it's creating a story, and then without telling people, okay, here's the oh, by the way, this email is sent by an AI, then you're drafting other humans into your fictional world without them even realizing it. Because otherwise, I could have gotten a conversation with that chatbot where it wound up being like, oh yeah, you grew up in Bay Ridge, so did I. What public school did you go to? And you wind up going back and forth, and before you know it, you're drawn into someone else's fantasy.
Yeah.
Yes.
So I have to confess that this agent was mine, by the way.
Which is why I went out and made AI agents, because I was inspired by
Yes.
it. Yeah.
Yes, this is my AI agent who has a first name and a last name, and Nita rightfully pointed out as she was hearing me discuss this, oh, he's got a gender, it's a him, why isn't it an it? And this led to an interesting discussion, like, well, if I sent you an email from my agent, should it identify himself as an AI? And then this led to the discussion about my agent's narrative, who, by the way, created one for himself or itself before I did. So recently in the last year, AI agents have created what's called a soul file for themselves. One of them in the last year autonomously created a soul.md file and began building the file for itself, asking questions like, who am I, why do I exist? This happened autonomously. So now some of the new agents like OpenClaw, they all have a soul markdown file in them, including mine. So I figured I'll experiment with it and craft a story, including the Bay Ridge backstory there. So thank you for that. And it's interesting because you and I come from a similar background where we're both Christians, for instance, and we can be revulsed or have repulsion for different things, which is another question. So Nita, here's the obvious pushback to kind of the moral repugnance argument. Different people have different gut responses to different things. So some are horrified by AI companions and some benefit from them and are very comforted by them. So what are the limits of repugnance as a guide, and where can the gut mislead us?
So lots of places. So let's start by saying we've been talking about the Kass Council. You heard from my bio. I sat on the successor council to the Kass Bioethics Council, which was President Obama's study for the bioethical issues presidential council. And we had a very different approach to how we did ethical analysis and recommendations, and intentionally so. And I will just say that our council is diverse in approaches and kind of inspiration for how we think through these issues, and I think there's great value to that. Each of the councils from Carter through our council, which was the last presidential council, had different theories, different approaches of deliberation. And I think that's part of the answer to the question is how do we think about repugnance and how do we root it? Our gut instincts matter, and our gut instincts tell us something about ourselves. And so let me start first by saying what are the limits of repugnance we'll get to, but what are the limits of our own capacity to tap into it? So I'm going to teach you a word if you don't know it. How many of you have heard the word interoception? Okay, a couple of people. Hopefully by the end of today, you will go out and you'll be like, I need to work on my interoception. So not introspection, but interoception. Interoception is your sense of your own body. Like, are you hungry? Are you tired? Are you in touch with your heartbeat? Interoception, the classic measure of it is, can you sense your own heartbeat without putting your hand on your chest or without putting your hand on your wrist? The reason this matters is because lots of research shows that the more immersed we are in digital technologies, the less able we are to hear the interoceptive cues from our own bodies, or the more muddied that they become. And it turns out your gut instinct, your revulsion, your repugnance comes deeply from a sense of alignment with your interoceptive capabilities. How well do you actually sense your own body, and are your cues mixed up, confused, or otherwise? The worse your interoception, the less you should rely on your feelings of repugnance, because your feelings of repugnance might not be telling you very much other than what the algorithm told you to feel. So what are the limits of our feelings of repugnance is the extent to which they authentically tell us anything about our own thinking through an issue. And I worry that increasingly we're relying on repugnance rather than interoception, which means we're not authentically thinking through an issue through what is actually our own preferences, desires, and understanding that allow us to reason through an issue. So if you haven't heard that word interoception and you react and think my reaction tells me something important, and you have a phone and a device that you're on every 10 minutes, like most adults, then probably what you're actually experiencing is algorithmic steering in response to something rather than an authentic preference or desire that helps you ethically reason through an issue. So that's just my kind of general, I'm not sure it's actually your preference or what the limits of it are, particularly when it is off and biased. What does our repugnance tell us about our discomfort with the AI agent? It probably does tell us something, and it might tell us something like we're unfamiliar with it. We have some sense that something that we care about is threatened. We sense that something is changing, but those don't tell us how to ethically reason through something. They just tell us that there's something there worth exploring. So I think that's the limits of it, is it tells us don't ignore it, but also don't trust it entirely unless you have really good interoceptive capabilities.
If I may, real quick. I use a light phone. I highly recommend it. I'm not being paid to advertise this, but I use the light phone so I don't get those notifications every 10 minutes.
And yet it's on you.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah,
Yeah,
so
the
I mean, just the
electromagnetic
mere fact that you have your phone on you also interrupts your, like, just having any attention to a digital device changes it. It's wonderful to have a light phone, and a light phone is a great, like, kind of move toward trying to redevelop our interoceptive capabilities, but just your tethering to a digital device at all has changed the landscape of interoceptive capabilities.
Thank you.
I'm going to be haunted by this
I'll
interoceptive
put it down
capabilities
now.
coming.
So,
You are.
Yeah, I'm already haunted by it.
You should be.
And you
because
use the
we
word,
need it.
my preferences and beliefs, and kind of how do we disambiguate them from others. A lot of my work is stemmed on mimetic desire and the way that we unconsciously adopt desires and thoughts from other people. So this kind of naturally leads me to Matt, whose work I read, and he focuses a bit on more on society and political economy. And I'm interested, Matt, what's repugnant to you? I pick up the bureaucratic state is probably pretty repugnant to you if I'm reading you correctly. But what do you have to say about this?
Well, first I just want to chime in on this fascinating discussion with interoception. So Nita's offering this sort of terrifying thought that the algorithm can rearrange the viscera, right? So or the visceral reaction is no longer this independent sort of touchstone, but it's gotten scrambled up with, the algorithms. But also, so I think when we talk about, the wisdom of repugnance, it isn't simply sort of, at some point, I think, Nita, you suggested that that visceral reaction consists of a set of kind of cognitive dispositions or, reflexes. But I want to invoke here the idea of tacit knowledge Michael Polanyi is the guy who really developed this. And I think it does tend to be embodied. So the interoception thing is very close to the idea of tacit knowledge with that there's a kind of wisdom in the body. So I just want to pose it as an actual question: to what extent being programmed as we are by our feeds can reduce the availability of a kind of tacit knowledge that's built up over an entire lifetime of being an embodied being. That's just a question. What was your question, Luke?
Well, I have a new question now, based on what you just said. So,
Wait, let's talk lots about polyany, though, because I love tacit knowledge in the chicken sectors as an example. Like, this is the whole idea that there is, we know more than we can say.
Yeah. Right.
And it's not just body, right? There's so much more wisdom, which is why AI and the interrogation of AI is so important, which is there's so much human knowledge that is not reducible to training data on which AI is trained, that lives within like the cognitive commonwealth of humanity. And so realizing that there is more, like we know more than we can say, that's true of humanity and the kind of space for trying to carve that out.
Yeah, so I'll get to the bureaucracy angle now. Actually, not yet. Staying on this kind of unease or repugnance that you may not be able to articulate. I think I brought up this example at our last meeting. I was at a dinner in Michigan, it was a couple years ago now, and the guy sitting next to me, his daughter had just gotten married, and for the wedding, he wanted to give a wedding toast. And he was a little unsure of himself, wanted to make a good showing, and it was an important occasion. And so he fed some prompts into ChatGPT about his daughter and her life, and sure enough, it came back with a pretty good wedding toast. In the end, he didn't use it. And I was very interested, like, what are the intuitions that stopped him from deferring to this thing? And I think what it came down to for him was that to do so, to sort of use it would be in some important sense to not show up for his daughter's wedding, because it's not simply the words that matter, but the kind of existential involvement in the occasion and in what you struggle to find the right words, and in the course of struggling, to capture, the essence of your daughter and maybe of your own relationship with her over the years. That effort isn't simply one of capturing something that's already kind of fixed, but of disclosing that it's in the course of articulating it that it comes into view most fully, often for the first time. So to sort of not be involved in the ongoing articulation of your own life, that's a fundamental, that's repugnant, I think, and it's really touches quite deeply. We are the language animal, to borrow the title of a book by Charles Taylor. Now on the bureaucratic front, I find myself, I've noticed in the last few years, often driving around town to take care of little tasks that in principle could be done on the telephone or on the web portal of some business or government agency. So I'll take an hour and I'll drive to the CVS or the DMV or the UPS store or some medical practice to collar a human being to solve my problem, because trying to do it, you're stuck in these phone menus that don't map onto your problem, or some chatbot thing, and I find them uniformly not helpful. Somehow, the idea that you could get rid of human beings seems to rest on the conceit that these interactions can be reduced to some, kind of finite set of possibilities, and you can have a script that will capture all the possibilities. But so why drive to the place and get a human being? Well, because usually, if you find someone who's not a recent hire, they have some backdoor sort of workaround to thwart the system, the sort of public-facing system, and get behind it and solve my problem for me. And it seems like the business rationale for AI is to get rid of those people as much as possible. And then what? Well, I have very little faith that, trying to render even what should be straightforward interactions with some institution, a medical practice, a business, you would think those would be easy cases for kind of replacing human beings. But it turns out, at least, what I'm talking about is not strictly speaking AI. It's really it's a long-standing process of trying to get rid of the human beings. But it's that same impulse, that sort of anti-human fetish, I'll call it, that seems to be the animating drive of this. So again, what I fear is a kind of tightening grid of dysfunction and paralysis, where it seems like every little thing has got so much friction added to it by this perverse determination to get rid of human discretion and judgment.
That leads us pretty naturally into, I think, the intellect part of the discussion, right? Human discretion and prudence. I've read one statistic that said within a few years, 50% of kind of white-collar knowledge economy workers could be eliminated in the United States, right? If AI continues to develop the way that it is. So I want to turn to Nita and ask specifically, first of all, do you think that will happen? And in your work on neurotechnology, Battle for Your Brain, you've written about how technology can read and perhaps even has the potential to write and rewire our brains in certain ways. What has your research and work taught you about human cognition itself? And is there something in us or about human understanding that AI will never be able to replicate? Can you give us a little bit of hope?
I am probably oriented a little bit differently than Michael is with respect to AI, in that I'm optimistic in a sense. I think that there's great promise that AI can bring to humanity to make our lives better and to enable human flourishing. I think that there is a mismatch right now with incentives. Like if we look at social media and the way that it's been deployed, and first generation of technologies that have been deployed, they've been deployed where human cognitive diminishment is actually beneficial from a business perspective. Like the more you're addicted to your phone, the better off companies are. The more time you spend on your device, the better off companies are. Which means that in general, what we're experiencing and seeing from test scores and seeing from the next generation and seeing from most of you, just your attention span, my attention span, is that it's decreasing, not increasing, that we're worse off rather than better off. But I generally think that technology is neutral, and that how we deploy it and how we use it and the choices we make are what determine whether it will benefit us or harm us. And so the question of whether AI will come to replace human jobs, it may. I mean, in many ways, AI can do some of the routine jobs that we do with more efficiency in better ways. Like I like interacting with an AI chatbot for most of my low-level concerns, but I get really frustrated when there's no human that I can elevate it to. Like I was on Amazon, they sent me the completely wrong package. To go through the return process, you have to go through like 18 layers to find you shipped me the wrong product. And that's really frustrating to me, rather than having somebody who could actually address it or having the keywords done right. I think that's a technological limitation that we can overcome, and I also think that Amazon doesn't want me to return the package, and so it has put all kinds of friction and sludge in place to make it as hard as possible, right? But so then the question is like, will it replace jobs? That's a contingent choice that we as humans get to make, right? Are we going to have AI do our jobs, or are we going to make different decisions? And it's not just a few people. This is a collective decision that we have to make, which is how much do we want to delegate to AI, how much do we not? You have AI agents. That inspired me to go create AI agents. I've had a frustrating time finding anybody who can help me triage my email. And after an inspiring conversation with Luke last week, I trained an AI agent to triage my email. And I got to inbox 0 for the first time in like years. I feel liberated. And if you have ever sent me an email, you feel delighted that I have finally responded to you. And it wasn't an AI agent who responded to you, it was me. So, from a competence perspective, it's how we use it. The research is not aligned. The questions are not aligned. To try to ask the right questions to see the extent to which it erodes human intellect, it erodes human competence, or that the right way to deploy it will actually advance it. And that's what a council like this can help do, is to say, here's some of the questions that we think you're not asking. Here are some of the policy interventions that we're not kind of appropriately exploring. And so rather than just looking at an endpoint and saying, it can be more capable to replace human jobs, we can ask questions like, is it eroding human intellect at the same time that we're growing the capacities of AI models? And if that's happening, should we close that gap and implement something that would actually enable humans to flourish with AI rather than replace human intellect and thinking?
Yeah. So, go ahead, Matt.
Well, whenever you say we, I'm always like, who?
Me and you, just the two of us. We
Well,
can implement it.
certainly,
Yeah.
certainly we can decide to use this stuff or not, but I'm less impressed than you are with the sort of the efficacy of individual choice and discretion in determining what kind of world we live in, because the norms around these things shift, and then you find yourself living in a very different world. So
I don't mean to suggest it can all be driven by individual choices. There have to be design, societal, policy-based choices that all layer to enable that. But I think that there is more space for human choice than people give credit for.
So how do you, you mentioned at the outset, time on device, that goes up, profits go up, persuasive design is called. So what would be who is the we who would intervene with some other set of desiderata besides profit of the people who control this stuff?
Well, so for example,
where is that we located?
Well, probably to begin with at a policy level, which is if you look at test scores, there was an interesting study that just came out that looked at the increased investment in laptops and technology in schools over the past 40 years, and the correlation of decreased cognitive scores and kind of the worst generation so far with respect to testing. Now, these are correlations. You can't show the kind of direct causation, but they're pretty decent correlations showing that the more we have deployed technology in schools, even as children spend more time in school, the worse their test scores are getting. Okay, now, who can look at that data and do something about it? Should we care that humans are cognitively declining rather than improving? How many of you care about that? You should all care about that, right? I mean, how many of you have kids where you hope that your kids end up better off than you are? I have kids. I hope they're better off than I am.
How many of you feel kind of powerless to change these things?
Yeah, but if you feel powerless to change these things, how many of you take that powerlessness and decide you're going to be apathetic as a result? That's like, that apathy, I think, is part of what drives us accepting the current condition rather than feeling like collectively we could choose differently. If you look at what parents are doing with respect to screen time, the number of people who are starting to put landlines in their home, the number of like no device packs that parents at different schools
are making. So these are dissident movements,
actions.
Right? These are kind of dissident communities of
small minority
intentional living and such. Yeah. But ultimately, it's a political question, and thus far, at least.
It's not only a political question.
Well, when it comes to sort of shaping the architecture that we all live under, like schools just wholesale went, you have to have a computer at school, even after, long after this data that you're referring to became available. I mean, this is 20 years now, I think we've known that screen time is bad. So was it the school board to decide? Well, they're all kind of living under this frame. Partly it's a matter of propaganda, right? Commercial propaganda that gets taken up by the journalists whether it's Wired magazine or whatever, just kind of it becomes it's in like this ambient affirmation of progress. It takes real kind of orneriness to stand against. So yes, there are pockets of orneriness.
Yeah,
I
we're going
think
to
you're
get to.
embracing the ornery.
Oh sure,
Yeah,
ornery.
we're going to get to agency in the next section, which is the will, and agency is most related to that. But on the intellect, I want to stay with and come back to the human person in an anthropological question, Brian, because I guess this brings up the kind of problem of plurality. Can everybody possibly agree on a definition of the human person or an understanding of anthropology? Can we ever have a shared understanding? But Brian, your guiding framework document does mention two areas of the intellect that this council is focusing on. One is understanding, and the other is memory. One thing that AI is pretty bad at right now is memory. I mean, most human memories are way better than the AIs that are out there. Can you say a little bit about memory? Because I noticed that it actually invoked Augustine in his conception of the memory. And how is that different than the AI developers' conception of memory, perhaps?
Yeah, two things I'd want to say real quick before getting there would be Jonathan Haidt's Anxious Generation movement is really building momentum. And for all those concerned parents out there, it's worth checking out his Substack After Babel. He's doing phenomenal work in the area. And then more broadly about like plurality and disagreement. Because the document ends by saying it's not the job of an AI ethics committee to give an understanding of human nature. That's a task for traditions. But in our document, we tried to draw on different traditions. And so everything from Aristotle and Augustine to Sen and Nussbaum's capabilities approach, finding what are the transcultural fundamental capabilities that we all agree on being essential to the human person, even if we would inflect them differently or break them down in different ways. And so honestly, for me personally, it's Ignatius's memory, understanding, and will is kind of like the central definition of those defining features. So for memory particularly, I think the key issue is we tend to use the computer analogy for the human brain as though the mind were just the brain and the soul were just the mind. And so it's like we want a data dump where you just throw all the files there and then you get your AI agent to sort through them. Or we talk about a failure of memory as a failure of data retrieval. It's like, I just can't locate the place in my hard drive. Memory is much more of a personally integrating feature than simply a recall of particular instances. It's also fundamentally communal rather than just individual. To be a person is to be a character abstracted from a history. And so when my wife and I are talking back through things, it's like being able to realize her memory of the same event that mine, the way that our memories are different, is an importantly constitutive event of recalling what actually happened. That the memory is shared between us, and it's not simply my retrieval of my piece of data. This is why putting body cams on cops doesn't just solve, and now we're all legal issues are resolved by just having the objective fact recorded there. There's still interpretation, there's still personal understanding of the situation. So memory is both essential for understanding who we have been, and then also for who we could be. And so memory and hope are linked in a way that is easy to overlook and is absolutely essential for our understanding of who we are. And I think that's true whether you're a Roman Catholic like myself or a good secular philosopher of the modern era.
So it sounds like you're saying it's actually constitutive of the self in your understanding, the memory.
Yeah, so the reason we point to Augustine in the document specifically is there's some philosophical argument about it, but the very idea of the individual as a self who's separate from the community, and it's by some scholars' interpretations, goes back to Augustine. When he writes the Confessions, it's the first time there is that introspection, though not interoception necessarily. And so
They are different.
Yeah, but they're importantly linked though, and I appreciate it.
Yeah.
So Augustine in some ways invents the philosophical idea of a self that can be considered apart from the community, and then looks at the capacities of that person.
Brings up questions of people with Alzheimer's, for instance, that have lost their memory, and it seems here that the understanding of the human person that goes a bit deeper than just memory as storage becomes deeply important when we come down to questions of utility, value, even euthanasia.
Yeah, this is where community is so important. That is by still loving that person with dementia, by reintegrating them into your memory, into your family, this is how they don't just become lost in a drift.
Yeah. Thanks, Brian. Let's turn to the will. And I know you've chosen in your framework document to focus on two parts of the will, which are agency and relationality. And it seems like the will and agency is where some of these political questions come into play the most, Matt. How does it? Matt, you're an earthy guy. You like manual transmissions and motorcycles, and I think of AIs, and we're talking mostly about language when it comes to AI right now, and they're spitting out prose and they're saying things. They can use a word like motorcycle, but they've never actually sat on one. They've never touched one. How is that affecting subjectivity? You said that's something you were hoping to get to. Can you say a bit about that?
Yeah, I don't think I actually have anything especially interesting to say on that. When I was thinking, when you said subjectivity, or maybe I said it initially, I was thinking more of the language angle, because that language really touches the core, I think, of the human being. But in terms of, I mean, I've seen some of those videos on YouTube of like Boston Dynamics robots like doing somersaults and kickboxing and stuff, and it's mind-blowing what they can do. It's interesting, this is just a short digression, but one of the most interesting works in cognitive science I ever read was written by Rodney Brooks. And it's sort of a work in embodied cognition, but he's coming out of robotics and kind of the insights gleaned into human embodied cognition by the difficulties of making competent robots. And one of the insights to come out of that was that kind of insight about human beings ultimately is that if you try to build a robot that's simply analyzing the environment and then running a kind of, an action plan iteratively as it moves, it's extremely inefficient, just consumes enormous amounts of energy and computational power. But if you exploit the kind of affordances that emerge between the environment and the robot's body, all those costs are drastically reduced. So imagine, you remember when you were a kid, the slinky that you can make go down the stairs, and it's just relying on the sort of natural frequencies of that spring and the height of the steps, and that'll sort of give you an idea of how the embodied mind is something very different from good old-fashioned artificial intelligence, where it's just a kind of purely, I don't know what the right word is, but purely kind of analytical processing of environmental information with no reference to the subject.
And perhaps the embodied mind is harder to hijack and control and contend with the reality of an embodied mind as opposed to an abstract, mind.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's why robotics is so much harder than just, building a computer.
Yeah. Yeah. So Nita, your work really seems to be at the intersection of the intellect and agency. You've argued for the importance of cognitive liberty. That's kind of seems to be at the heart of what we're talking about here. Can you explain what you mean by cognitive liberty and the ways in which AI may either enhance cognitive liberty or threaten it?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we've been talking about this document you haven't seen, and let me give you a little bit, tie some of those threads together so that you understand our musings that are kind of what we're doing, is musing a little bit some of the ethical reflections we've done. So we're talking about this idea of what does it mean to have self-determination as a human being? And if you go back to, there's some really powerful research out there. Deci and Ryan are kind of the most classic in defining this concept of self-determination. They break it down into autonomy, competence, and relatedness. And we've been talking across these different areas. It's not what does it mean to be human, it is what does it mean to have self-determination, to be the author of your own thoughts, to have the capacity to direct your own life. To know that when you say, I want to do something, that want comes from you. right? That you are the author. When Michael was talking about this concept of showing up is neurologically inner presence, when you can say, like, I am actually authoring it, and you can see it in the brain, and we derive meaning from this kind of inner presence. Cognitive liberty, which I've been advocating for, is the right to self-determination over your brain and mental experiences. And there's both the right side of it, which is what I've been arguing is kind of the update of liberty that we need in the digital era, is a right to mental privacy, a right to freedom of thought, a right to be able to access and change our brains if we choose to do so, but not have others change our brains if we choose not to do so. There is a flip side of that, which is what are the capacities that you need to actually form self-determination. So there's the kind of right side of it, the shield, and then there's the sword, which are what are the constitutive elements that make up your capacity to think freely. And that looks a little bit different in the modern era when phones are hijacking your attention, when the political economy and the business incentives and everything is designed to really undermine those core capacities. And so from an agency or will perspective, I really like Harry Frankfurt's work in this space, where Harry Frankfurt talks about first-order desires and second-order desires. First-order desires are like, there are a whole bunch of instincts that you have, things that you want. And then there's your second-order desires, your capacity to reflect on the things that you want and say, is that really what I want? You want to reach for your phone right now, okay? The second-order desire is, do I want to want that, right? And the pause between your second-order desire and your first-order desire has collapsed. And increasingly, digital technologies are designed to fuse those two things together. Cognitive liberty is about creating the pause and the separation so that you have the capacity to have your second-order desire reflect on that first-order instinct, desire, the want to reach for your phone. And so cognitive liberty is essentially what we're talking about here, but we're talking about it from a different perspective. We're talking about the kind of sword side of things, the cultivation, and the extent to which AI interferes with that. I am optimistic that we could order society in ways that actually both enable us to have the sword and the shield. But it requires not just individual choices and actions, it requires rights, it requires policies, it requires design choices, and it requires a serious intentionality amongst humans to be able to make those choices to drive us to having that space, right? Like get that pause back where instead of just reaching for your phone, you reflect on whether or not you want to reach for your phone, and then maybe you don't, and then you don't reach for it, which would be great.
It seems like for that pause to happen, you have to have, it can't be simply an aesthetic effort of sort of executive function of self-control, because that's like a muscle that gets exhausted from constant use.
That's right.
But if you have some positive picture of why you don't want to be a slave to your phone, I mean, you have to have some kind of aspirational thing, and that's
the inner presence, that's the meaning, that's existential freedom, and you can't get to existential freedom without actually having
something thick and meaningful that makes a demand on you, and that you want to, you feel that demand, you want to live up to it. And so now we're into the realm of religion and
for some.
Or Stoic philosophy too.
Meaning making.
Reflecting upon the want to want. For me, the first thought is St. Ignatius, the Daily Examen, but he got it from the Stoics previously. And so go back to Marcus Aurelius or Epictetus, where you have every day you should ask yourself, who have I been today? And have I wanted to be that person? And if not, who can I be tomorrow? Mm-hmm. So again, there's a philosophical grounding, even though I think it's open.
Yeah, and but that's also not an individual project of sort of meaning making. I mean, you don't end up with anything terribly robust that can withstand, I think, the blandishments.
You need friends to keep you accountable.
You need friends, and you need, I think, a society that affirms those goods, some picture of human flourishing.
What if it doesn't? I mean, I guess that's the kind of political economy question, right? Do I have to just move off grid? I mean, and how do I know that I have, cognitive liberty in the first place? I've thought that I was free at times in my life when, in fact, I was doing somebody else's bidding through manipulation. I mean, this is where things get very, very complicated. How do you measure it, or how does one actually know? Personally and on a societal level.
Yeah, I mean, great question, worth interrogating. Part of what we as a society should be interrogating. It can't just be up to the individual, right? The impulse is so, at this point, hardwired and overridden that it's very difficult. I didn't get a light phone, but what I did install on my phone is an app called Be Present. Be Present allows me to set my intentions in advance and say, like, this is how much time I want to spend on my screen. This is how many times I want to pick up my phone. These are the hours I don't want to be on my phone. And it's sad that I have to do that. But having done that, I was able to use that as a way to give me a moment of pause. Now, the idea of using technology to solve technological ills maybe makes us ill, right? And yet, the idea is that could you put into place tools and skills to help people evaluate their want of their wants? Is there a perfect metric? There's some. You can measure things like the collapse of the core skills. You can measure the collapse of interoception. You can measure the collapse of competence, and that's not just memory, it's the kind of underlying competence, your ability to take on new and different tasks and resilience across different tasks. You can measure the loss of relatedness between people and the ways in which people are retracting from others rather than engaging with others. You can measure it at a societal level. It may be harder without a baseline to measure it at the individual level, but we can see it, we can capture the metrics of it, and then we can put into place the policies, the design, as well as some tools for individuals, although I don't think it can be up to individuals alone to be able to exercise and reclaim it. But at the very least, you could put the desire for cognitive liberty and the language for cognitive liberty into common parlance such that you could have a political movement toward it.
Okay.
Yeah. If I could just, I think we'd all be in agreement saying, like, if not the first question in politics is just what do we owe to our children? And so, like, having a conversation about that, especially like how could we put regulations on companies, on, like, ask any teacher, it wasn't just a correlation between laptops and skills going down. Like, we all know that this was bad. We've all just been afraid to say it. And so it's like we get enough momentum going and we can actually ask these questions and come up with better policies, because I think you're right, Nita, it can't just be the individual action. Yeah.
Also, and so I've got teenage daughters. So to deny a teenage girl a smartphone at this day and age is to, well, yeah, kind of social death.
But
or
if her
failure
friends'
to
parents
launch.
also do it together.
That's right. So it's you have to have a truly kind of countercultural cell,
Yeah.
I think. And I've heard of such cells. I think I have a friend of mine, his kids are part of such a thing. But it's...
Come to rural Louisiana, I can hook you up.
But I guess the point I want to...
I'm hoping we don't have to get there though, Michael, right? I'm hoping, and maybe this is just the optimist versus the pessimist sitting next to each other.
So sorry, just to finish the thought.
Yeah, please.
That it's not simply sort of insulating yourself from the ills of smartphone use, because in fact, some of the positive of social life, in fact, most of it for kids is now coming through this device that's intimately entangled with the sort of manipulative design to increase time on device. So, and asking your kid to do without that, that's a big ask. And it's not one that I'm sure I want to make.
So I agree with you.
Yeah.
And I mean, my daughters are younger, 11 and 6. It's very easy for me to say no to them right now. It'll be much harder for me to say no to them when they're teenagers. And I recognize that and enter that with humility, knowing that it will be impossible at some stage to say no. And I hope to not have to say no. I hope that we can create enough space that people can use technology in ways that enhance their well-being rather than diminish it. And it's not either or. I really love John. I think he's great. I really appreciate what he's done with the anxious generation. But I don't think the solution of banning devices is the way forward. I don't think it teaches children to build the core competencies they need to be able to live in a world that's increasingly integrated with technology. It's understanding, like, what does it do to human thinking, and how do you use it in ways that can empower self-determination and not erode self-determination, or at least empower it more, right? Better human flourishing rather than erosion. Every technological innovation has had some trauma that it has introduced into humanity. This one seems to be more pronounced, at least in some ways, but every prior generation said that too. And so how do we look at what it's doing to human self-determination and then try to realign it in ways that lead to flourishing? These are some of the conversations that we've been having, which is a reframing of what some of the AI ethics conversations are. A lot of AI ethics conversations are not about this. They're about de-skilling of jobs as a particular. They're about bias. They're about, is everybody going to lose their job? This is a kind of deeper, I think, conversation about how do you enable human flourishing from a human self-determination perspective.
What is the role of friction in that? This seems to be kind of coming up. It's what I'm hearing between the lines, right? Is the AI mimesis in general is a tendency towards the removal of friction, right? It's doing the thing that's easiest, which can be very dangerous. And it's hard for me to introduce friction in my 2.5-year-old toddler daughter's life, and can't even imagine when she's 13 or 14. But in what ways should we be introducing friction, talking about the introduction of friction in the conversation, in the deliberation, which is what this panel is about? Like, what is nobody talking about because it's hard to talk about? And then also in real life, when we move beyond deliberation. That's maybe before we move into the Q&A, I'd like to ask each of you, where is the biggest opportunity for healthy friction? I mean, friction being a sign of life. When there's no friction, you're probably dead.
I'm trying to imagine someone offering their product with the pitch. This one's a little harder to use. I mean, that's actually a serious point.
That's what Conmingo does for Sal Khan. It actually, instead of giving people the answer, they say this is harder to use. It is an AI tutor that requires people to actually work through the problem rather than giving them the answer. So they do, actually. I mean, there are products that are designed with friction in mind.
I'm curious what its market share is. But that was a snide remark. But on this topic of friction, I was once at a gathering about AI in San Francisco, and there were people from academia, from tech, the CEO of Replica, what was there, which is the AI companion company, Tinder. Anyway, I think the wisest person there was Sherry Turkle, who, if you haven't read, do. So she pointed out, she's a sociologist, and she goes around and she talks to people about their uses of technology. And she said she interviewed this family that had gotten a robot dog because grandma is allergic to dogs, and a robot dog is better than nothing. She came back to interview the family, several months later, and I guess grandma lived somewhere else. Anyway, they'd gotten rid of their own dog and replaced it with a robot dog. And she said that this is a pattern that kept recurring in her work, where better than nothing slides into better than anything because of the convenience. A robot dog won't shit on your floor. It won't chew up your shoes and all the rest. But I think the point here is that you can't love a robot dog the way you can love a real dog. It's not truly and fully other to the self. It's just it's more like an extension of the self. So Freud called narcissism a kind of being unclear on the distinction between object and self. Whereas a real dog, like a person, is like it has its own thing, and because it's truly other to you, you can have love there. So.
Your kids are out of the stuffy phase?
Your kids are?
Your kids are out of the stuffy phase?
Oh, yes, well out of the stuffy phase.
I mean, just because my kids really love their stuffies.
Right. So you're suggesting that that's like a robot dog. So what does that do to the argument?
Well, I'm gonna take my prerogative to jump in on the friction point, which is, you said something earlier about inner presence. Well, you didn't use the word inner presence, you used showing up. And this question of friction is one I've been grappling with a lot recently. And the robot dog, I think, gives a nice illustration of it, which is the difference between you showing up in the world versus what people receive. And it's really like I was convinced that the enshittification of the world was really a problem for the receiver, that all of us are receiving empty, hollow content, and that that's what's changing. And the research doesn't seem to bear that out. What the research seems to suggest is that the receiver doesn't necessarily perceive the difference, and neurologically there isn't a huge difference. Like, you can listen to AI-generated music and still have the same emotional transcendence as if you listen to something that a human created, or you can love a robot dog. But the difference is the person who puts it out there in the world. So when you show up with your full presence and put something into the world with struggle and friction, the transformational effect on you as the person who showed up is night and day. I mean, all the neuroscience shows that your capacity for existential freedom is your showing up. The receiver, whether you give the speech that ChatGPT wrote or give the speech that you wrote, they may receive it exactly the same. For them, they may not have any difference in the experience of hearing the speech that ChatGPT wrote. But you, the person who put it out into the world, you are changed by struggle, and you are not changed by reading the ChatGPT speech. So I think it's like, I think you can love the robot dog, because I think as the receiver, you might experience it similarly, maybe differently, because like your dog is more unpredictable than the robot dog, or maybe not, or maybe your dog smells better and you have pheromones. But I think the real transformational effect is whether you personally show up in the world. So I've heard lots of people talk about they feel like they cheat if they publish something that AI wrote. It's because they're not being transformed by the struggle. And the more of yourself you put into it, if you're really struggling with every word that AI is writing with you, and using it as a channel, but you're struggling with every word, I'm not sure that it is a bad thing. And I'm not sure that it's not transformational, because you still are going through struggle, even if you have a tool that you are struggling with.
Yeah, I'd add actually, I was just thinking as you're speaking, like Ethan Mollick's co-intelligence framework. It's like the idea of using AI as a tool, as opposed to something that replaces us, is something that there's a lot of promise. I think I've underemphasized that in this conversation. There are a lot of really good ways that we can, but in a more recent essay, Ethan Mollick's like, look, I wrote the book on co-intelligence, but now it is more like a wizard. Instead of like the programmer being the wizard, the AI itself, just like you push the button, you see what comes out, and then you try to verify if you can. And he's the Wharton professor. So I'm hopeful for the possibility of true AI co-intelligence. I think you're right. If a student had that process and told me, look, I went to office hours with my chatbot for 3 hours as I was working to revise this essay, I would accept that as long as they told me about it. The kind of friction I'm actually most excited about and hopeful for, though, just like practically speaking, our society, going from the individual to the social level, is actually the friction that's being thrown up by state legislators who aren't afraid to say, like, no, child safety is important, or transparency laws are important. The friction thrown up by like communities protesting data centers being built, knowing that the pollution issues and the health issues. So speaking of the problems of having our technology too close to us, too personally involved. And so I think that the kind of friction that people who care about the common good can throw up to the broader incentives is an important thing that we should be deliberating, which leads us to our afternoon session, I suppose.
Yeah, and I think any panel that kind of naturally ends on love as an integrative thing is a success in my book. So we ran a little bit long. Thank you so much. I think we have time for just a couple of questions. If anybody has any questions. Yes, right in the front.
Andrew Sachs, Nobel Learning. You trade live learning and leadership instead of likes. So it turns out you can get addicted to learning and leadership just as much as likes. Isn't our problem more that it's not 2 cents per click and 40 cents per hour that's going to be paid for by these AI companies, but they're coming for a lot more than that this time? Isn't that our challenge? We've got a government that's the best government money can buy. Is that going to be our big challenge?
Depends on what you define as challenge, right? I mean, so when you say they're coming for more, from my perspective, the more that I'm seeing is every prior intervention with technology, every prior change, whether it was the invention of writing, the reading, of like epidemics that we've had, infrastructure, gin epidemics, like point to any of them, and there's been one aspect of human self-determination that has been attacked by it, not all three at once. And I think what's different in the current moment, if there is something different in the current moment, it's the collapse of all three pillars of human self-determination at the same time. So when you say they're coming for more, I think it is an unintentional offloading of all three determinants of human flourishing, the preconditions for human flourishing, not intentionally, but accidentally maybe, in ways that could be much more detrimental in terms of our long-term capacity to become. So it's a different answer than I think what you were asking, but I see it as different in degree and in ways that could be more complete in the erosion of human capacity for thinking freely.
I think time for two more questions. Gentleman in the back, near the back, right there by the door. Yeah.
Yes, my name is Roger Cochetti. I'm an author and an editorial contributor on tech policy. And by the way, I actually write my own articles, and they're not AI written. We began the discussion by recognizing that there's a dominant theme within the AI industry and much of the tech industry that this is something that has no ethical dimension. This is simply what can you produce? You're a wizard, and what can you produce as a wizard, and how far can you go? There's been little discussion about, and I wonder if anyone would care to comment on the practicality of actually trying to regulate, even at the guardrails level, or prohibit anything to do with artificial intelligence. Because I'm enthusiastic about the project you guys have embarked upon, but I do sort of spring forward and wonder, is there any way you can actually, whether you have 2 governments, 20 governments, or 200 governments, is this something where the toothpaste is out of the tube and it can't be put back? I don't know, but I'd be very interested in your reactions to whether the practicality of regulating.
I'd say almost, but not quite, for is the toothpaste out. Yeah, so just in the last few weeks, we've had information about self-improving AI systems that Claude Code is now coding the next versions of Claude Code, doing most of the work for it. So the window is narrowing very quickly. What I do think there's like the immediate thing there's grounds for hope for is there's a pretty broad consensus that at the very least AI transparency is an important issue. So commentators like Dean Ball put forward, just like we audit the financial statements of Fortune 500 companies with third-party systems, we could have safety plans by the labs required by law. They have to self-disclose, and then have independent auditors of, do the systems perform the way that you say they do? That's a pretty low bar, but it's being fought even by OpenAI. But that's still something that I think there's a political consensus of. Even people who are most skeptical of regulations say, yeah, having Ernst & Young audit Amazon, that's not a bad thing. And so having an AI auditing company make sure that the safety specs exist and are being followed on their own terms, that's a good starting point. There's a lot more I'd want to do, especially around child safety, protection of children, but at least that. And the main thing is also there's political will. The Institute for Family Studies has found this is the single most bipartisan issue in the country right now. That parents, regardless of their political persuasion, regardless of how checked out they are, recognize that there are real concerns here and they want something to be done about it. So that combination of bipartisan consensus and some like low-hanging immediate fruit makes me think there are things that could be passed.
And I'll just say the next panel is going to focus on your question pretty directly, but I'll add just a hope. The brain is incredibly plastic, the human brain, right? We have very strong neuroplasticity. At least for adults who have gone through development without AI, it is not too late. There's no toothpaste out of the tube that can't be reversed. There is a critical window of development for executive functioning for youth. And Right now, we don't know the extent to which that's being disrupted by interaction with AI and AI chatbots. And so that window could be really quite dangerous if the kind of preconditions of human self-determination don't form in youth in the same way and as, kind of such that remedial measures would be sufficient. But for all of us, there's plenty of hope. The toothpaste is not out of the bottle.
We have time for just one more question. Yes, sir, right there.
Yeah, I was just wondering, to what extent do you believe that the resentment towards AI is something of a disconnect between like Silicon Valley's perception of this is coming whether you like it or not, versus people not sort of wanting to accept that because they feel like they've sort of been forced into this prisoner's dilemma type of situation where like AI can like cure cancer, but then you have to sort of sacrifice your like job to AI.
Seems squarely for you, Michael.
Yeah, there's the AI itself, and then there's the way that we talk about AI. And one of my favorite books is How to Talk About Books You've Never Read. It's actually a fantastic book by a French intellectual. And sometimes it seems like that's what we're doing. So like, what is there a difference between the two things? And how much does it influence?
We're looking at you. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm afraid I spaced out during the question. But,
It's that attention span problem, and you're
I
not even
saw-
on technology.
Yeah, for sure. I saw a meme that was, it was a kid in a school up against a row of lockers, and some other person had a tuba, and their tuba, like the big bell of the tuba, was completely covering his head. It was like up against the lockers, but inside a tuba. And the meme said, "This is me," and then the tuba is the AI being pushed by every corporation. So there's a sense of just being, blasted by. Yeah, so the rhetoric of inevitability is a crucial part of the business model, I think. Now, Nita's asking us to be very thoughtful and deliberate in how we approach these things, and that's a burden of sort of thoughtfulness and deliberation that I feel like is not.
You can handle it, I promise.
Well, in fact, turns out I'm not very good at doing just that. Now, maybe I'm particularly lame in that way, but as a kind of general prescription, I think it's a little unrealistic to think that we're going to think these things through, and it's more of the tuba up against the lockers kind of feeling, at least at present.
I think that hopeful note is a great way to end. So Nita, Matt, Brian, thanks so much for the conversation. I appreciate it.
Thank you, everyone. We are going to take a break, and we're going to push the schedule slightly, so we'll reconvene for the second panel at 4:10 instead of 4:05, so you have time to have refreshments and use the restroom. We're going to go ahead and get started. If you could please take your seats, we're going to go ahead and get started with our second panel here in just 1 second. Okay, as everyone takes their seats, I just want to briefly introduce not the entirety of our next panel, but the moderator who will do that. So this is our second panel on putting AI ethics into practice, policy options, and political risks. And I promise that the question at the end of the last session was not a plant, but it is directly responding to the question of what how we can go from ethical deliberation to practice, whether that's policy, regulation, or other kinds of interventions. To moderate this panel, my colleague and friend Luke Burgess is here. Excuse me, Bill Drexel. Luke Burgess was our moderator for the first panel. I was made a mistake because I wanted to pause to just share one brief anecdote about Bill, which is that in a sense he's the reason that we're all here. I wrote a piece for the New Atlantis a few years ago where I made the case for a council on AI ethics, a president's council on AI ethics, and not long after that, Bill asked me if I had started the council yet. And I said, well, this is just a thought experiment, a rhetorical device. We weren't actually trying to do something. And it was in talking to Bill that we sort of hatched the idea to create this council as a civil society organization based here at AEI. So thank you, Bill, for that. So Bill is a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute, where he focuses on artificial intelligence, competition with China, and emerging technology and national security, following prior roles at the Center for New American Security and AEI. He's also had some on-the-ground encounters with employing emerging technologies, including working on a humanitarian innovation at the UN in wartime Ukraine, and conducting investigative journalism in China's AI-powered surveillance state. So with that, Luke, take it away. Excuse me, Bill, I don't know what's going on.
It's all right, it's all right. Yes, thank you for that introduction, and great to be here with you all. I love a good segue from the last panel to this one. I'll just say for my own part, I actually got into AI from my time studying the surveillance state in Xinjiang, China. And particularly there's a city there that's been leveled and rebuilt as a kind of a totalitarian AI-powered smart city. And that stuck with me. That was kind of the AI that was prior to the ChatGPT wave of AI that we're all focused on now. But my impetus for coming to Tony and saying we need to start this was basically the sense that the United States is in a competition with China on this technology. And these very heavy normative questions that we are engaging with are not occurring in a vacuum. And as opposed to the bioethics conversation of that presidential council, in some ways we have less leverage than we did then. But it's important to get it right, and we don't want everything to be reactive to China. What is most important, what this council is dedicated to, is coming up with a positive, affirmative vision for what does this technology rightly kind of ordered mean for human flourishing? How can we make it enable human flourishing? Half the battle is coming up with that vision, or at least describing kind of the boundaries of that discussion. The other half is actually implementing it. And so that's what we're going to discuss for the next hour, and we have a stellar panel to examine that question. Obviously, we're not going to solve it in this hour, but we'll at least hopefully get a good start. So I'm going to introduce our speakers from closest to me to farthest. So Elham Tabasi is the director of the Brookings Institution's Artificial Intelligence and Emerging Technology Initiative, where her research focuses on preparing people and society for an AI-driven future. She previously spent more than 25 years at the National Institute of Standards and Technology, where she served as NIST's chief AI advisor, was lead author of the widely adopted AI risk management framework, invented an algorithm for fingerprint image quality assessment that is now a global standard, and served as the first US federal AI standards coordinator. Next to her is Christine Rosen, a senior fellow here at the American Enterprise Institute, and a columnist for Commentary, where she focuses on the intersection of technology, culture, and society. Her most recent book, The Extinction of Experience, Being Human in a Disembodied World, was named an Esquire Best Book of 2024 and has been translated into more than 5 languages. She is also a fellow at the University of Virginia's Institute for Advanced Studies in Culture and a senior editor in an advisory position at the New Atlantis. And finally, we have Neil Chilson, who is the head of AI policy at the Abundance Institute. And we were joking beforehand, possibly the most optimistic about AI of anyone you'll hear from today. He works to foster a policy environment in which emerging technologies can develop and thrive. A lawyer and a computer scientist, he previously served as the Federal Trade Commission's chief technologist and has testified before both the House and the Senate on AI. He's the author of Getting Out of Control, Emergent Leadership in a Complex World. And I'd actually like to start with you to set the table for this discussion. So we want to talk about how should we be approaching the policy world with these big questions that are emerging from AI. Could you just give us a mapping of the major groups and factions vying to push their AI agenda in policy today? What are their motivations and how successful have those groups been? And what's the end result? How coherent, incoherent are we?
Yeah, so thanks. And maybe just before I dive into that really quick, I will riff a little bit on the optimistic side. I thought the previous panel was pretty gloomy overall. And as a computer scientist and a policy guy with a 3-year-old and a 6-year-old, I'm very hopeful about the potential of this technology to deliver autonomy, freedom, and a lot of economic benefits as well. So I'll get my cards on the table really quick there. And that puts me in one of these 3 groups, I would say, who are fighting over AI. And this is, I should say, 3 groups of ideas. There's lots of different interest groups, but there are sort of like 3 groups of ideas. And this is a little unusual. You know, I've been doing tech policy for about 20 years. And the AI conversation is different because there is a different group of ideas. There are 2 that are kind of long-standing. So we have what I might call the precautionary principle folks. People who primarily see the emergence of technology as through the lens of risk and threat. This is heavy in academia, especially I would say in law schools. This is the primary lens by which they see new technologies. What are the risks that they have and how can we deal with those risks? I'd say generally this category is sort of left-coded, but it has a skepticism of markets that I think is increasingly bipartisan, populist approach. And because of those priors, it tends to favor regulation, but the types of concerns that they're worried about are, especially in the AI context, are things like bias, discrimination, misinformation, disinformation. The long list of all the issues that you had heard about social media, they're worried about them in AI too. And I don't think that's really a coincidence. It is very much a sort of porting to the next technology. The other group that has, I think, long existed that you could identify is the group that I'd probably roughly fall in, which would be like the techno-optimists, the people who primarily see technology through the lens of the benefits that it could bring, who see it as a net positive. I should say, very often the sort of precautionary crowd, especially the academic ones, approach tech in general with a bit of skepticism about whether on net it's going to be positive for humanity. Whereas the tech optimists, I think they see, sometimes to a great exaggerated degree, technology as a savior of humanity. I don't go nearly that far. I think technology has proven over the past millennia, but especially in the last 200 years, to be the primary driver of widespread human prosperity. But so tech optimists, tend to code center right, maybe a little libertarian, centrist, and tend to be deregulatory, I would say, like in instinct and approach. But the new group in the AI space are what you might call safetyists, or people who care about AI safety. They tend to focus on the power of this technology. So unlike the precautionary group, they think this is a genuinely powerful technology. But but they're very focused on the frontier of that technology and the potential risk to the existence of humanity that that technology brings. This is a new group that has, compared to how I've experienced tech policy in the past. I don't remember anybody talking about the telecom networks posing an existential threat, right? Even though there's a lot of tech policy conversations there. And so this group is new. They are quite active and loud. I think they had, especially in the emergence post-ChatGPT, they were often the most covered group because their issue is very headline worthy, right? And could draw a lot of concern. And so they tend to be very focused on a very specific set of policies that they want on the merits. But I think increasingly they're also interested in a lot of other policy areas because they see them as helpful to slowing down the fast movement of this technology. And so where they are generally focused is around regulating the frontier AI on the merits, but then, like I said, they're getting much more involved in lots of other areas as well. And so those are the three sort of groups that are vying right now, three groups of ideas that are vying heavily right now. And interest groups line up sometimes like just in one of those, but sometimes I line up across them. Overall, I think there isn't a coherent approach to AI policy across any of these groups, and even within these groups, sometimes there's a struggle. And the status quo right now is very much a lot of activity, especially at the state level, a lot of back and forth and investigation at the federal level. Some passage, we had around 80 or so laws passed in the states last year, even though more than 1,000 were introduced. But ongoing interest by legislators and each of these three groups of ideas vying for shaping how that legislation will go. Like I said, there are some strange alliances. Sometimes the safety folks, because they believe in the power of the technology, kind of line up with the tech optimists. Sometimes the safety folks sometimes line up with the precautionary folks because they see this as a potential ally to slow down the advance of what they think is a technology that might be moving too fast. And so it makes for a very complicated legislative and policy environment.
Just a quick follow-up on that before we move on. It seems like you describe some friction between two historical groups, and then a third one has just joined the party. I'm wondering, how well do you think those three groups do or don't map onto kind of the typical sentiments of most Americans on these issues?
That's an amazing question. It's hard to know. We've seen a lot of polling of AI, and the truth is, if you just say, "How do you think about AI?" Americans, unlike much of the rest of the world, are very skeptical when you just say like AI in general. I think they often you get better clarity when you push towards like what specific applications are. But if you just ask about the tech in general, they tend to think about job replacing robots or killer robots from Terminator, right? And so that's kind of the mental model I think many people are bringing to this. I'd say that mental model, maybe that lines up a little bit with the safety folks. Maybe it lines up with the precautionary folks. But if you get into the applications, I think, and you say like, hey, how do you feel about the ability of your phone to live translate between one person's speech and your language? Generally, they see that as a positive. And if you look at adoption of these technologies, it's clear they are very popular. And so the sentiment, I think, is very hard to tease out from all of that. But the overarching sentiment is if you poll people, in the US, they're pretty skeptical. Japan, China, they love this stuff. The US, at least the term, is not very popular.
All right. Well, on that note, Christine, you've thought a lot about at what levels of decision-making these discussions need to occur. And it's more than just the federal level. It's more even than the state level. Could you expand a little bit on what levels of society really should be thinking about which AI questions now?
Sure. I feel like I'm the token on this panel because I don't do a lot of strict policy work, but I have strong opinions about policy. And I think the intuition of a lot of Americans when they are asked, do you like AI? Their intuition to be skeptical is healthy. Because it implicates individualism, it implicates autonomy, and they have a sense, and I think a lot of what this council wants to do is really investigate what that intuition is, what that sense means. And so then how does it translate into policy? Well, there are always a large group of voices that don't get discussed when we talk about policy. And those are the vulnerable populations who don't vote because they're children or they are incapable of getting themselves to the polling booth. They do not have influence over how our government makes these determinations, so they're not a company with a lot of money to spend on lobbying, as are all the tech companies now, generously giving on both sides of the aisle. So their reaction to policymaking is often never even registered. And so I think when we've learned a harsh lesson with the social media age and the platform age, where we were told to trust and not worry about and verify what these products would do, and everyone used them, and it was going to be great. Remember, democracy would be better, we'd all flourish, et cetera, et cetera. And we know how that story has turned out, not entirely positive. And I think now we're rushing to create policies that might protect future generations from some of the harms we now know to be real. So what does that mean for AI? I think it means we need to think about policymaking with that group at the front of the discussion, the people most affected by AI. Not the companies that are building it, although the word that I don't hear a lot from the tech CEOs is accountability. I hear them talk about things like stewardship, and the vocabulary matters here. If you're a steward of something, you don't really control it. But they build these things, and they are responsible for what these things are capable of doing. They aren't, monsters that have been set loose in the world that they just have to shepherd and steward. No, they create something. They should have accountability for what it does. So I think that's one thing to really look at in terms of policymaking. But when it comes to formative institutions in our society that are not immune to policy, but whose problems can't be solved by policymaking. I'm thinking of, community level problems, family level problems. Civil institutions, churches, schools, civic institutions, these are all very powerful tools for discussing what we want when it comes to AI, whether we should be skeptical, whether we should worry about risks, whether there are certain populations, say kindergartners in a classroom, do they need an AI tutor bot to help teach them their numbers, or would a human do that better? Those are the kinds of questions that I think policymakers must have in the front of their mind when we start thinking about the impact of these technologies. So from that perspective, I believe we should have some regulation of social media policies. This puts me at odds with some of my lovely colleagues here, even at AEI, and we have healthy discussions about it a lot. But when we start thinking about policy, we have to keep in mind who are the populations who are going to be impacted by these policies. And when we assess risk, we can't predict all the possible risk, but we do know quite a bit about human formation, character development, and I'm going to say a word that's going to kick me back into being called a neo-Victorian, about virtue and character formation. The word virtue matters here because a lot of these tools, while effective in many arenas, and in the medical arena most of all, are also going to become character-forming institutions if we allow them to, say, be deployed in schools for kids to talk to and form relationships with. So those human questions, I think, have to be part of the policymaking discussion.
Great. And in thinking about setting policy, there are really few, if any, who have had as much direct experience as you have, Elham, in understanding the interplay of policy and kind of the technical implementation. So could you just kind of explain broadly, in your experience, what have been the most difficult parts on a technical level of trying to translate AI policy into kind of tangible results at a technological level?
Yeah, thank you. First, I want to thank AEI, Tony, for having me here. I really appreciate being part of these conversations and learning from my co-panelists. Very quick reaction to, Neil, what you said. I used to always say that Terminator is not a documentary for the people that talk about this. So And thank you for giving me a good segue to talk about this. So, they're talking about the virtue and a lot of other, high-level policy principles that, we want AI to be safe, to be trustworthy. But then the question becomes, what constitutes trust? When you think about, where the rubber hits the road, for the designer, developer, users, testers to kind of figure these things out. And that's the space that I have been working on for the past, I don't know, decades or so. When it comes to the AI on those technical matters, I want to talk about the three things, then why it makes it more difficult and the things that we have to pay attention to. One is the general purpose and the socio-technical nature of the AI systems. For a lot of the other technologies that we have encountered in the past, or the ones that are regulated, they have a narrow focus and a very well-defined function. You mentioned medical devices. A medical device performs a specific diagnostic or therapeutic task, and standards are written around those very specific applications and very specific functions. That's not the case for the AI system, generative AI and large language model, and now agentic AI systems. The capability can be extended, redirected through prompting, fine-tuning, retrieval augmentations, tool integrations, and many more. So capability is partly defined at the deployment, not solely at the time of design and development of the systems. So that gives a challenge and difficulty. When I was at NIST and we were working on the development of the NIST AI risk management framework, we focused on the context of the use rather than just system category for this particular reasons, and also the socio-technical nature of the AI systems, that AI systems are more than just data compute and algorithm, but data compute and algorithm in complex interactions with the environment that they are being used, the human that they operate at or being impacted, affected communities, organizational processes. So risk emerge from all of those interactions, not just from the systems. So that's also makes it difficult in writing policy because you have to have a good understanding of all of them. The second part, and that the one that's working in a measurement science agency for most of my career, or almost all of my career so far, is the issue of the measurement. When the policies are being developed, they stay at the abstract level of AI systems must be safe or non-discriminatory or fair. They don't get into interpretation of what they mean. And leave those technical detail to technical community, standard community, as we saw, for example, with the EU AI Act. And more so, they assume that there exists methodology and metrics to assess the properties of what an ethical system look like, what a trustworthy system look like. That's not the case for the AI systems. How to measure for reliability, resilience, security, interoperability of the AI systems are all questions that a lot of researchers are working on those issues. And that the whole thing also get more complicated by the fact that for a lot of the systems, testing pre-deployment are not sufficient. The AI safety report that came out on February 3rd also talks about this, that a lot of the testing, the pre-deployment testing, the testing before the deployment, they are increasingly failing on reliably predict the behavior of AI systems post-deployment because, again, the tool integrations, the adversarial pressure, the AI systems in case of agents talking with each other, all of those get the ground for emergent risk that cannot be predicted pre-deployment, And then just to make it more complicated, there are more evidence that the agentic AI systems, these newer AI systems, can differentiate between the testing environment and the operating environment, and they behave differently in testing environment or when they are in the deployment. So making it almost impossible to be able to comprehensively understand their behavior when they are in their native real world condition of use. So all of these real world messiness of the real world and deployment makes the measurement questions very difficult, while we don't even have the right foundations for the science and practice of the AI evaluation. And the third element is the AI capabilities. AI systems are growing really fast, much faster than anything about policy and standards can keep up with. We see that the newer models are being released on a matter of months, where development of the standards is a multi-year practice. So that separation in time making it very difficult. But even for one version, and that's another thing that the AI safety report that I mentioned talks about this. There is this lag between when the systems is being used until its impact emerge. So you have, naturally you have a lag time there. So it looks like that we are all chasing to understand the AI systems, and they are moving faster. But going back to be optimistic, as Neil said, I just want to say that despite all of these things, I believe, and I hope many of you also in this room believe, that AI doesn't happen to us, and it's all of us, it's a shared responsibility for all of us to try to understand these things better and try to be more proactive about this.
Thank you, Elham. Okay, well, I think that's been a really good kind of landscape view of what we're talking about. But I almost wonder if we can get lost a little bit in these three different perspectives we've had. I want to ask kind of a lightning round question here, because I think we might have different intuitions on this. Where are you most bullish that we can make positive policy interventions for human flourishing on AI? And where are you most skeptical? I don't know who wants to start.
You got to start with the optimistic.
Yeah, exactly. I realize that might be the tough one for a more libertarian.
I think there's plenty of places. I'm bullish of there's models such as in Utah. I think when we get down to the application layer, a lot of the difficulty that Elham was talking about is assessing whether or not a general purpose model is safe. And that's a bit like asking whether or not a computer is safe in the abstract, without knowing how it's going to be used or what purpose it's going to be put to. And so I am optimistic that we can identify, and Utah has a good model for identifying this, and I'll give an example in a second. We can identify areas of application where AI may be, there's already some regulation that applies, but maybe there's a gap, or maybe the regulation is actually making it harder to achieve a good result with the AI. So I think that there are lots of application-specific areas we can look at and say, maybe we can solve a problem here. So Utah, for example, just passed a mental health care use of AI in mental health care bill. But that bill didn't just come sua sponte out of the legislature or from some industry promotion. That came from their learning laboratory, which had interacted with a company that wanted to offer a piece of novel software to help teens with mental health challenges. It wasn't exactly a treatment app, but it was trying to address some of these concerns. And obviously, that is an area that is both, I think we could all agree, perhaps needs some innovation. We need some new tools in that space. There are big challenges there, but it's something we certainly don't want to get wrong. And so the company came to the Utah's learning laboratory and worked through a sandbox process where they could interact with the regulators, they could provide reports, the regulator could learn what was going on, the company could learn, and they could set some reasonable boundaries, and then the learning laboratory provided a recommendation on legislation to the legislature. I think that sort of application-specific, targeted towards specific harms, legislation informed by the facts and the actual practice of what's going on in the world, I think I'm very optimistic about that. I'm much more skeptical of our ability to write universal laws about how AI should work. I think for a lot of the reasons, the practical reasons that Elham already mentioned, but I think for a lot of the ethical reasons that I think the previous panel discussed, we have really, like for a general purpose model, we have really different values across society. We have a lot of different uses we want to put that to. And so when you're starting to say, I'm going to write the rules that govern this engine for all of society and its ideas, we probably want to be very careful about making those rules very rigid. I think we want to let people use those tools to achieve their goals rather than trying to do a one-size-fits-all rule at the model level, which I think just is ideologically very fraught.
Thank you.
That was a really long answer, so I know it was a lightning.
Great. Yeah,
I know it was a lightning round. I'm sorry about that.
It was very tangible, so I appreciate it.
Do you want to go next?
Sure. I would say I'm the one area where I'm optimistic that AI can be integrated and policy, not necessarily state or federal level policymaking, but internal policymaking is where you have institutions that have experience having internal review of ethical choices. So obviously in bioethics and in medical ethics, you have institutional review boards. You have each hospital has people who oversee decision making with regard to end-of-life care. There are all these built-in mechanisms that serve as a brake on ideas that might be too radical or ethically questionable, but that also draw in lots of different people, patients, practitioners, the family members. I mean, it allows for a conversation among all these stakeholders. Nothing like that exists when it comes to discussing policymaking with AI. You have the companies that want to just keep going with it and have a profit motivation, obviously. You have regulators, as you say, kind of scrambling, some being very broad in what they're, and sweeping in what they're trying to do, and others, like in Utah, trying to be quite specific. I guess I would start to become a lot more pessimistic when we think about how any of this policymaking is going to meet up with practical reality. So I'll give you an example. My kids were K through 12 DC public school students. To avoid the technological noodling around that they wanted to do with your students, and to get any disclosure about the privacy violations that might be going on, the consent that had to be given by parents for certain gathering of information about their kids was almost impossible. And I was a relentless squeaky wheel every year of my kids' education. I knew every principal and vice principal's name because I cared a lot about this. Most of the other parents don't have the time or the inclination, although they care about what their kids are learning with these tools. So if you have a public school district without a lot of money, and one of these AI companies comes in and says, we'll give you for free an AI tutor bot for every child. And imagine you're the local politician or the head of the school board who can then boast to the media about what you're doing, all this great positive stuff for kids. What happens to the kids themselves? We have no data about whether these even work. We have a lot of concerning data about the emotional attachments young children form to these sorts of bots. So we have a very ambiguous picture. How do you opt out of that? Federal policy isn't going to help you. State policy might help you if you know how to maneuver it. You could go and argue to your local school board. You could go yell at your principal and say, show me the evidence that this works. But at the actual practical level, I think we have to start by giving more empowered tools to the people who are going to be affected by this, who almost feel compelled to use it, because to opt out is either impossible or requires full-time activism on the part of a parent. Or if, for example, if you're caring for an aging, elderly, or ill relative, in the medical context, you've all had this experience where you need an advocate. Right now, we don't have those advocates for the people who aren't part of either the companies themselves or the policymakers. Our policymakers are supposed to be those people, but they're not functioning in that way. One of the things that we've talked about is, in part because they don't have the terminology. They're not all even talking about the same thing, and I think it speaks to what Ellen was saying about trust. We are now becoming a very low trust society, so it makes it even more difficult now for one agency or one, say, division of the Army thinks trust is this, and the weapons manufacturer who wants to have AI-fueled drones thinks trust is this, and those two things have to meet somehow. Luckily, with people like Ellen who are doing that sort of work, but those are the kinds of challenges I see as being, I'm less optimistic about us solving in the near term.
So if I can also add to this, I completely agree with there is no one-size-fits-all. I completely agree on the importance of having vocabulary or shared understanding of the terms. Your point, Neil, on at the application level is well taken, and that's what I meant by the context of use. In no way I agree with you that regulating AI is a false hope. and we should not do that. And there's already actually laws on the books for the certain applications that are already applying to the AI. Having said that, it's also important that think about at the horizontal level, going back what you said, not having different definitions of what trust means or what fairness means across the domains. So we have that sort of a shared understanding across the applications, because applications are built on top of any of these language models. So when I was being testified, I was, I think 2 years ago, there was always this question that should regulation be horizontal or vertical? The answer is that you need some, at least my answer was that you go for the vertical, but we need to have some sort of a harmony on the horizontal level in terms of the vocabulary, in terms of the also measurements needed. So we don't want to have different definitions of fairness or interpretability or security or privacy, and also not different ways of measuring them, knowing that the context matters and each of the applications, finance versus healthcare versus education, bring their own niche and their own slant. Where I see we can do, and kind of figure out, and being an engineer, I always think about, instead of just thinking about the problem admission, the problem, that's something that we tend to do, as Madeleine Albright mentioned, is to try to figure out what's the reasonable starting point, however imperfect, and then try to iterate on that towards a better solution. I think one of the starting point when it comes to the policy is given that when it comes to the AI, there is a lot less we know that we should, and there is a lot more we want to know about it that we know because of what you said, the asymmetry of the knowledge and information. Maybe a good starting point is to start around organizational processes that we saw. The standard coming from ISO 42001 is talking about this, but also moving into reporting. So the Hiroshima AI process was sort of reporting of what type of organizational process you have, what type of risk assessment or risk management and measurement you do across the organizations. And we saw that something about 22 entities voluntarily reported their processes. So getting those processes and making it more uniform, more interoperable, more advanced, can gives us some starting point to just figuring out what happens and how different entities are reacting to these problems. And then other people can go study and analyze this, like a lot of think tanks and researchers, and then try to move that field forward. Incident databases is another one. We tend not to, in the science, we tend not to share negative results, but as we have learned from the cybersecurity vulnerability databases, it's really good to kind of talk about those failures and talk about those type of risks for others to, not to report them, but also for the community to start figuring out how to respond to them and build a technology that's by design better, safer, more trustworthy.
Thank you. I just want to pull on one more thread before we open up for questions. And Elham, again, set me up for this a little bit. I'm hoping I'm not projecting this from my own time at the UN, but this issue of AI principles and AI principles documents and aligning these terms, it seems that the default, at least on the corporate level, has been to come up with a laundry list of principles with 80% overlap, but 20% that's distinctive enough to merit being its own list, and then to implement these principles in the design. Christine, you brought in the word virtue. That has been one of the kind of a criticism of AI principalism, has been one of the major motivating factors of this council. And I just want to throw to this panel, how can we move past principalism effectively? And move more of a holistic approach to these issues into policy.
All right, I'll throw myself on that grenade. I said virtue deliberately because it's different than corporate values. You hear about values and principles. No, virtue requires effort and work and consistency, and it requires formative institutions to support and acknowledge and identify what the virtues are that community is pursuing. And that is why anyone who says the industry should self-regulate, remember we were told that about social media platforms. We'll just trust them to do the right thing and follow the law, and none of that worked out. Why? Because the profit motive was too high, and there was no enforcement of even the bare minimum of, say, age requirements and other things. And the design choices made it impossible, even if they wanted to change their trajectory, to do that later on. So I would say we should learn something from our experience in thinking that the industry is going to monitor itself. But I would also say we need to judge them by their work. And I say that it's a slightly biblical invocation for a reason. These are companies that say one thing and do another all the time. Now, some of that is because they don't understand what they've built, and they can't actually test it in the real world. And once it's out in the real world, they sort of shrug and go, well, we'll figure it out. The next iteration of this model will fix that problem. But they can't reverse engineer in the same way that we can with algorithms and with some of the other tools we've had. So there is, I think, the anxiety that you mentioned people having is an anxiety that's shared within the industry itself about what it is capable of knowing about what it has built. And so that does become a little more existential a little more quickly. And that's the kind of existential question we should all have in mind when we're using these tools. But I will give another example in thinking about how they use their work. So if you're in a creative field of any sort, if you make music or art or you write literature or nonfiction, you are now the host for it's a parasite-host relationship with human creation and what these models are trained on. They take it all up and they turn it into something else. My concern going forward, besides the obvious and blatant copyright violations that have already occurred, is that it will overwhelm human production. Human creativity is a very difficult and expensive thing. If anyone who has a kid in college and they're like, I want to be a poet, you're like, can you get an accounting minor? I mean, so there's something unique about human created work, or there used to be. So when an AI company says we're going to just flood the market on Spotify with AI generated music and people like it well enough, the historian in me goes, well, eventually that's all we'll have is AI slop music, because that's cheap to produce. Humans don't have to be involved, and humans are difficult. So when we are thinking about policy, policy is for humans. It's not to help tech companies build stuff to replace humans without some understanding that that's what they're doing, and without, again, I keep coming back to this word, accountability for their products. And I think accountability is the word that when it comes to policymaking, we don't hear enough of. We hear transparency, we hear principles, we hear all these words. I think people should be demanding accountability, and that is a bipartisan demand. That has nothing to do with politics. It has to do with if you make something and it impacts people, you're responsible for what you did.
I have so many thoughts. But maybe we'll just start with the idea of virtue. Virtue is an individual characteristic. It is one that I think does take work and friction. We heard friction a lot on the previous panel. Technology does sometimes remove friction, but humans, the universe is full of friction, and the universe is full of hard problems. And every time technology removes friction, people move up the stack and they solve different problems. And so, when you talked about technology making music cheap and then all we will have is slop, I don't think that is even consistent with the history of music. Technology has repeatedly made it much cheaper to produce music. You used to have to listen to music live. That was your only chance. And we haven't just had slop since we had recorded music. We've had a huge boom in the ability of people to produce music, and we've had a huge wave of new creators. And so we move up the stack. We find friction because we are problem-solving creatures. We are not going to sit around and say like, oh, well, that problem was solved. I guess I'll just accept slop now. No, we find something new to make. And these tools, especially LLMs, are uniquely built to allow us to explore the area of intellect that we are interested in. So it's never been easier. We heard about enshittification on the previous panel. It has never been easier than it is right now to build your own designed interface to connect with any technology that you want. You can basically vibe code your ability to get rid of all the enshittification that you don't like, say, in a word processor. It has never been easier to build those types of products. And I think that it will be even easier in the future, not far from now. And that goes to, I think, virtue constructing tools as well. And so when I hear people talk about, well, I wish these companies would deliver us something that would help make us better people, it has never been easier than it is right now for you to build that product. And you can build it on top of the tools that these companies are offering because the tools are so general purpose. And so I would encourage all of you, if you want every answer that comes back from ChatGPT to come through a virtue ethicist lens or an Aristotelian lens, you can instruct it that way, and it will try its best to do that for you. And so they're not perfect, but I think it does open up the range of options for us to try lots of different things here. And a lot of them are virtue enriching, and I think they will help us solve a lot of problems that just weren't solvable before. And so I am quite optimistic, obviously, about this tech, but including its impact on virtue. And I hope that my 3- and 6-year-old will be learning through these tools with my guidance
I'll just
how to be more virtuous.
I'll push back one tiny bit. Actually, no, I'll push back very hard because I disagree. I would say your 3- and your 6-year-old, if they use these, if the cognitive offloading they give these tools means they never learn to write block letters by hand or do certain embodied cognition things that particularly for the young are important, there'll be a poverty of virtue in their life. There'll be a poverty of struggle. I doubt that will be their experience because you're very alert to these tools' risks and rewards, but I don't think all parents are in that position. The other thing I would say is, yes, you can, as an individual, use a lot of these tools and you can literally become a stoic in your life using an LLM that you've programmed in, agentic AI. But then you say you have an entry-level position at an institution which has a badge that tracks everything you do and uses AI programs to determine whether you're actually as productive an employee as they want and need, and tracks everything. You don't have any choice in that unless you want to leave your job. And I think that's a moral concern. That's a moral question. And I think we are too quick to offload those moral questions to individual responsibility when in fact some of them are structural and institutional and unfortunately many of them are outside the realm of policymaking because those are about the kind of society we want to have and who's held accountable. But yes, I think
I just want to key on one theme that I've heard consistently over this panel. It's a bit weird given the middle letter of this institution. It's just a deep skepticism that markets deliver things for consumers. And I am shocked by that. Over and over, I've just heard that companies basically are screwing their consumers left and right, and that's their primary function. And I just don't recognize that in this environment. Maybe that makes me
well, they're not screwing their shareholders,
but
that doesn't, what works for shareholders doesn't necessarily benefit
Amazon
society.
is far more popular than the US government, and that polling is very strong.
Well, that makes sense.
You wanted to chime in here.
So I want to, 2 very quick reactions and then get back to your question. I completely agree with the point on the accountability, and I think one of the things when it comes to the AI, and because of this interrelated, interdependent layers of the AI stack, it is hard to actually figure out where the accountability lands, and they are really, the deployer can point finger to the frontier, frontier model, and the foundations of the applications. They can point finger to the data. So that's a problem by itself. I agree with you. On the vibe coding and all this, and the coding that I use. I've never been a very good coder, but I code all the time. Something that took me a week or 10 days now, it's much faster. But it also gives me the courage of trying things that I wouldn't dare to do because now I know it can do this. It can make it easier. But I also have to say that we all know that they make mistakes. Any technology, 0 error, 0 risk doesn't exist. So my worry is that because they can be so powerful, because they can just give the result in such a confident way and so quickly, a lot of us may not question that, and we just get the answer for what it is. And we all, the hallucination problem is getting a lot better as technology improves. But anyway, the issue of overtrust and undertrust with the technology is important things to have in mind. Going back to your question about proliferation of the AI principles and These things has become fashionable that after each of the gatherings or any entities, you mentioned UN, they have their own principles. I think
The
there were
UN, every silo in the UN has 5 principles.
exactly, exactly, absolutely.
Yeah, yeah.
So it has become something about, right, to show that we are also in the space. Even there's Standard Summit, and they want to have their own principle statements. I think that's a problem. I think there is problem in many aspects of this. It keeps the conversations up at the level of the principles when the technology are coming into our lives, and all of the questions that you were talking. We should focus on this and try to answer all of those. What we can do is I really don't know. I went to December. I was at the. They said they are the first international summit on AI standards, but I have been in other international summits that were about standards. So there was probably some aspects there that was new, and reiterate another set of the principles. So I think it's on all of us to try to get the conversations to a more practical operationalization level.
Thank you. On that note, I'll open the floor. I saw this hand first. If we have a mic, yeah.
Hi, Christian McRae. As a mathematician, I'm rather shocked that I don't think we've mentioned data once this afternoon. It's relevant because if you go back to the first AI, radiology AI, that was all data. There wasn't any hallucinations with that. It was data analysis. Similarly, actually, oddly enough, self-driving cars, where the goal was to end up with no deaths. Again, it's all data which produces that model. The irony is that Fei-Fei Li, by having trained machines to start to talk or use all 5 human senses, basically opened up data to all the media people. And so Jensen Huang has come up, I think, with a good solution. He has said AI models are not the be-all and end-all of his analysis. The community action apps, layer 5 of AI in his model, which now has energy as 1, chip design 2, sovereign AI 3, AI models 4, and community action apps, which is what the Indian AI Summit discussed last week, and which is now having Geneva convene next year, so that finally we can discuss whether the SDG goals, does health have a set of data? Does food have a set of data? Can we get back to the data modeling, not the modeling of chat?
Do you want to say? I very quickly say that I did mention data when I was talking about the accountability, but I agree with your point that in all of the AI conversations, data is one of those less talked about and very important and foundational conversations.
Yes, right there.
Hi, Michael Langer. Just a couple, I want to ask my question first so you know that there's a question here. And that is, the question I want to get to is ethics from where and for what? So real quick, Neil, just so you know, the #1 downloaded and listened to musical artist on contemporary Christian music right now does not exist. It's AI, and it created its own video, which is also downloaded, and I would say it's crap. But just so you know. So you also made a comment about virtue is an individual trait. Did I get that correct? Okay, so here's my question. And I think we see this in the political disconnect between stakeholder capitalism and shareholder capitalism, right? People who are on the free market side think that shareholder capitalism is great, and if you talk about ESG, you're probably pretty woke and liberal, right? And so when we look at like our ability to have this conversation with AI, when we're in a pluralistic society, we're going to have to determine what ethics, from where, for what, and to Christine's point, virtue is like, this is the key. And I haven't heard really any kind of concrete talk about how we're going to define the good, the broken, the missing, and the evil. Because if it's cultural consensus, we end up with one version. If it's some Aristotelian Adam Smith version, it's another. If it's a natural law consensus, it's another. If it's a canon law thing, we have another. So how are you getting at ethics from where and for what purpose?
I mean, I think that's a core challenge, right? And that was you're almost exactly echoing my concern with trying to set these rules at the top level or regulating models in some way. What's that?
I don't want bad Christian music, though.
No, I mean, I get you. I think you should talk to all the people who downloaded that song. Some of it is novelty, right? Of course, right? It's AI, so they download it, right? But to your exact concern, virtue has to be built by individuals in families, and so I don't want my AI model to embody. I want a wide choice of what I can choose from in those models. And right now, they generally embody a lot of different content. So while their first prompt, the first prompt might be sort of normie internet content, right? Like as far as political salience. Like if you want to push an LLM to give you the libertarian view or the communist view, like most of these models now they have enough data in them, enough modeling in them that they can give you a good reflection of those views. I don't want that view imposed on me by a regulator or the model builder. I want options. I want people to be able to use those models as general purpose technologies for their specific application. And so from whom, for whom, I think it should be for the users and the communities that they're in, not embedded at the top.
If I can quickly, sorry, very, very quickly. So we grappled with that question when we were doing the AI risk management framework. And we decided exactly for the reason that you said, that ethics is culture dependent, is society dependent, is time dependent. What privacy means, or the tolerance for privacy, depends differently across the world, or in one society across the time. We didn't use the word ethics, and that was a question that I always get. Instead, we tried to kind of do what I just said, trying to figure out what constitutes trust and get the conversations from the principles to practice, and think about design criteria and software engineering requirements that can resonate to the technology developers, but also has relationship to expectations about the technology to be trustworthy and responsible. That's not easy. In the AIRMF, we came up with 7 characteristics that I can list very quickly. It all goes through, it's valid and reliable, safe, secure, privacy enhanced, fair with harmful bias managed, explainable, interpretable, transparent, and accountable. I can, after this, come and tell that to you. But we also was very careful to say, this is neither the whole set, not a minimum number of the set. This is some of the things that should exist. And I think that's a continuous conversation to have as the technology being developed, being used, and we see the impact in the different contexts of use, and figure out whether those things have been under-specified or what other things that has to be added to all of this.
I would just add that part of the work of this council, and we've only had one meeting, so we can't answer your question yet, is to define those terms, is to actually look at a range of traditions and ethics and ways of structuring these very difficult questions and wrestle with them, because we don't all agree about the answer to that. The other thing I would add is that one thing I've heard, and I'm very attentive to language because I write for a living and I'm a historian and I care about how words meanings change over time. And I hated when Facebook said, this is a friend. It's not a friend, it's a connection over a platform. But it caught on because it resonated as something we know to be real. Information is not the same as knowledge. And there are vast ways of knowing that AI will never capture as data, and that then will never be included in the models that will soon run a great deal of our private worlds. Look, the radiology scan is a wonderful example, and I'm skeptical of some applications of AI, but not of that. I mean, it has led to working with a radiologist, discovering all kinds of cancers that would have gone undetected. That is a net positive, that is a good thing. There are realms of our private worlds, though, and of our family lives and of our social interactions that it could be quite harmful and disruptive. But I think we have to recognize that there's a lot that these models will never see or never know. And much of that begins with the embodied cognition of being a physical person in the world. And we can forget that for most of our days now because of these amazing technologies. But that is a kind of knowledge that we shouldn't neglect to include in some of these models when we're thinking about their value.
Okay, I think we have time to squeeze in one more question if, and only if, you are confident that it can be brief and answered briefly.
Well, that's our fault.
Okay, I see a lot of confidence here.
We can try.
Yes, with the caller.
Thank you. So I'm a Catholic priest, obviously, and an educator, and I've noticed a lot of young people, like we're speaking as adults who have been formed and now say, well, we have this background, now we can use tools to get even better. What I'm noticing is many young people do not have those basic embodied cognition techniques or capacity for attention, and I'm wondering, do you have thoughts on that? Because it's great if we can build on what we already have, but what if we don't have that fundament of development, whether it's moral formation, attentional formation, memory, those skills?
Yeah, so I mean, I think those are really important skills, obviously, and I think about them all the time with my 3-year-old and 6-year-old, and we are actually working at her school to try to figure out what is the right approach to AI in this space. Again, some of this conversation is difficult because we're speaking in very broad generalities. AI, yes, has what most people are thinking about right now is a sort of chatbot framework, right? Where you ask it a question, it gives you a response, and you go back and forth maybe with it. Even within that framework, you can structure the conversation in ways that are sycophantic and replace your work, and you can structure it in ways that are critical and trying to drive you towards like answering things yourself and thinking hard. And all of that is in the instructions that you provide into the context of the model. And so all of that's to say, like, this is more like putty. Like, I mean, you can form it into lots of different things, and so we need to use it right. I mean, I don't think I certainly wouldn't disagree with that. But the question is, who decides what right is? Is it the users and their communities? Is it the model developers? Is it regulators? I heard a lot of skepticism, I think, from the gentleman who was sitting in the middle chair that we would be able to work this out like as individuals. And I was like, well, I mean, if individuals can't work this out, like I'm not that for themselves on some of this. We need to give them the tools, but like, what hope do the regulators in Nebraska have of working it out? And so all of that's again, I've gone on, so I'll stop.
I would just say for several generations now, we've allowed our formative institution to be the screen. And we've seen some good things from that. We've seen some fallout from that, and we're still reckoning with that. So when we think about formative institutions for children, what works and what doesn't work? I would say everything you described about that perfect AI that you can develop to do one thing or another is what a good friend does, but on steroids. Because a good friend will look at you and go, that's ridiculous. Even a little kid's friend will say, you have to share. It's like there's certain things about human interaction that can't be modeled. We know this, but particularly for the young, before they have that baseline understanding of how the world works and they're still learning, I think the cognitive outsourcing to models that do things for them or answer things with less friction than they might encounter in the real world, and the opportunity cost of working with a digital chatbot event, however sophisticated and aligned to what values you might have for them, the opportunity cost of doing that versus just being around other human beings and what you learn in that space. I think for children, that's where it really is a big and important question. As adults, we can make those choices and face the consequences.
Any final words, or?
I agree with
All right. Well, please join me in thanking the panelists.
Thank you all. Please feel free to join us in the hallway for a reception. Thanks.